And all right, a minute late. Sorry, I forgot to do something right at the last minute. Had to run out of the room and take care of it, but all is well now. So today, what do we have? We have Bruce Orr doing his testimony in front of the Committee on the Judiciary in a joint session with the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight in the U.S. House of Representatives last year, specifically Tuesday, August 28th last year. You can see on the left side of our screen here, I've added a little montage, a mosaic, if you will, of Bruce. Up at the top left, we've got Bruce and his wife, Nellie. Nellie, of course, I don't know if she still does, but at the time of all this going down, she worked for Fusion GPS and Glenn Simpson, which, of course, figured rather prominently in the entire Russia collusion thing, if not almost wholly. So that was important. At the bottom here, we've got Bruce on the left, and the indomitable, and the great Richard Steele on the right-hand side. And they, of course, know each other very well. And then in the middle, we've got Milton from Office Space. Like Milton, Bruce Orr was demoted several times. I don't think they ever put him in the basement and cut his check, but they may as well have. And I think, if you look not too closely, you can see a resemblance between the two. Take a bunch of pounds off of Milton, clean up his skin a bit, and you just about got Bruce Orr. Maybe you don't see that. I don't know. So anyway, let's see. I've got the live chat up. We are streaming. Health is good. Let's rock and roll. Executive session. Committee on the Judiciary, joint with the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, U.S. House of Representatives, Washington, D.C. Interview of Bruce Orr, Tuesday, August 28, 2018. Washington, D.C. The interview in the above matter was held in room 2141, Rayburn House Office Building, commencing at 9:05 a.m., and I have 9:04 on my clock, so we're off to a good start. Mr. Parmenter, good morning. This is a transcribed interview of Bruce Orr. Chairman Goodlatte and Chairman Gowdy requested this interview as part of a joint investigation by the House Committee on the Judiciary and the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform regarding decisions made and not made in 2016 and 2017 by the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding the 2016 presidential election. Would the witness please state his name and position at the Department of Justice for the record? Mr. Orr, good morning. My name is Bruce Orr. I am a senior counsel in the Office of International Affairs in the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. Let me just interject for a second here. Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, whose testimony I've read over the last couple of days, they were both, if you will, hostile witnesses to the Republican majority on the committee. And of course, last year, the Republicans were the majority, and then after the midterms, and then in January when they took office, the Democrats became the majority in the House. So now they run these committees. Fine. People voted that way. That's how it turned out. Now, Bruce Orr, if you will, is on the Republican side, in a sense, in this hearing. Because he came forward and said, look, I was really helpful with Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS and Christopher Steele in getting this dossier to the FBI. I was a conduit. So, in a sense, his testimony is more geared towards the Republican side. I have not read any of this previously. I'm not familiar with the testimony, aside from one or two blips that came up when it was first released earlier this year by Representative Doug Collins. But I'm very interested in seeing how the dynamic between the Democratic and Republican sides in this committee plays out. I think it'll be pretty interesting. Picasso Knows sent out a good morning. Thank you, Picasso Knows. All of those who may know Picasso Knows as my technical director, you may be very pleased to find out that she has now been promoted to executive producer because she got me lunch yesterday. No, she's terrific. She's terrific. I couldn't do this without her, and I very much appreciate her being around to help me with this stream. All right, back to Mr. Parmenter. Thank you. On behalf of the chairman, I want to thank you for appearing today, and we appreciate your willingness to appear voluntarily. My name is Robert Parmenter, and I am the Majority Chief Counsel for Crime and Terrorism at the House Judiciary Committee. I will now ask everyone else who is here in the room to introduce themselves for the record, starting to my right with Art Baker. Arthur Baker, Investigative Counsel, Majority Staff, House Judiciary. Trey Gowdy, South Carolina. Jim Ratcliffe, Texas. Daryl Issa, California. Andy Biggs, Ohio. Matt Gates, Florida. David Lassiter, Department of Justice. Rebecca Heckman, Clifford Chance. Joshua Berman, Clifford Chance. I'm pretty sure Clifford Chance is the name of the law firm. Those are the people, along with Lassiter from the DOJ, who are there to represent Orr and help him avoid the minefields of answering questions that may be involved in active investigations and things like that. So Lassiter, Heckman, and Berman, those should be Orr's counsel. Brad Weissheimer, Department of Justice. Ira Harahan, I don't know how to pronounce Ira's last name, so from now on she's Ira H. or H. Judiciary Minority. Valerie Shen, Oversight and Government Reform Minority Staff. Christopher Ventura, Legal Clerk, Majority. Steve Castor, Oversight Staff, Majority. And Anudeep Budharaju, House Oversight Majority, who will be B from now on. Megan Green, House Oversight Majority. And back to Mr. Parmenter. The federal rules of civil procedure do not apply in this setting, but there are some guidelines that we will follow that I will go over. Our questioning will proceed in rounds. The majority will ask questions first for an hour, then the minority will have an opportunity to ask questions for an equal period of time if they choose. We will go back and forth in this manner until there are no more questions and the interview is over. Typically, we take a short break at the end of each hour of questioning, but if you would like to take a break apart from that, please let us know. We will also take a break for lunch at the appropriate point. As I noted earlier, let me back up. Lunch today, we're going to break at noon. I'll be back at 12:30 for the next section. What I did yesterday was I went till 6, took a half-hour dinner break, or 5:30, excuse me. I took a half-hour dinner break and then came back at 6. That was a longer transcript. That was over 300 pages. This is under 270 pages, if I'm not mistaken, right around there. So if, as 5 o'clock starts to roll around, it looks like we don't have much further to go, I will, of course, accept the majority decision, but it is my inclination to keep going past 5:30 so we can finish it in one shot. If anyone objects to that, they can let me know. I will, of course, announce this again later on. But it's my hope that we can finish up not too late into the evening tonight. So we'll see how that works. Let's see. Take a break at the appropriate point. As I noted earlier, you are appearing today voluntarily. Accordingly, we anticipate that our questions will receive complete responses. To the extent you decline to answer our questions, or if counsel instructs you not to answer, we will consider whether a subpoena is necessary. We also have the ability to go into classified setting, but it was represented to us that there is going to be very little that is classified today. There was a lot classified in the Lisa Page interviews and a little bit in the Strzok interview, but for the most part, Strzok just did a very good job of avoiding answering any questions that could be considered classified, much to the chagrin of the majority staff in that interview. There's a lot of redactions in the Lisa Page interviews. As you can see, there is an official reporter taking down everything we say to make a written record, so we ask that you give verbal responses to all questions. Do you understand that? Or, yes. Parmeter. So that the reporter can take down a clear record, it is important that we don't talk over one another or interrupt each other if we can help it. That's been the norm in these hearings so far. A lot of interruptions, a lot of talking over each other. Usually with the Republicans stepping on Peter Strzok because he won't answer a question. But it happens on occasion. Happens more often than I would find comfortable, especially trying to read these transcripts. Interruptions make it a little difficult to keep up speed. Both committees encourage witnesses who appear for transcribed interviews to freely consult with counsel if they so choose, and you are appearing today with counsel. Could counsel please state your name and current position for the record? Mr. Weinsheimer. My name is Brad Weinsheimer. I'm an Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Mr. Berman. My name is Josh Berman. I am Mr. Orr's personal counsel, and I'm a partner of Clifford Chance. Heckman. My name is Rebecca Heckman. I'm Mr. Orr's personal counsel. I'm an associate of Clifford Chance. So we got that right. Parmeter. We want you to answer our questions in the most complete and truthful manner possible, so we will take our time. If you have any questions, or if you do not understand one of our questions, please let us know. If you honestly don't know the answer to a question or do not remember, it is best not to guess. Please give us your best recollection, and it is okay to tell us if you learned of information from someone else. If there are things you don't know or can't remember, just say so, and please inform us who, to the best of your knowledge, might be able to provide a more complete answer to the question. Mr. Orr, you should also understand that although this interview is not under oath, you are required by law to answer questions from Congress truthfully. Do you understand that? Or, yes. Parmeter. This also applies to questions posed by congressional staff in an interview. Do you understand this? Yes. Witnesses who knowingly provide false testimony could be subject to criminal prosecution for perjury or for making false statements. Do you understand this? Yes. Is there any reason you are unable to provide truthful answers to today's questions? No. Finally, I'd like to note that, as Chairman Goodlatte stated at the outset of our first transcribed interview in this investigation, the content of what we discuss here today is confidential. Chairman Goodlatte and Gowdy ask that you not speak about what we discuss in this interview to anyone not present here today to preserve the integrity of our investigation. This confidentiality rule applies to everyone present in the room today. That is the end of my preamble. Do you have any questions before we begin? No, I don't. Thanks. Parmeter. The time is now 9:10 a.m., and we'll get started with the first round of questions and Chairman Gowdy. So now we start with the formal examination, and we start with Mr. Gowdy, who I miss terribly. Love Trent Gowdy. Is it Trey Gowdy? I think it's Trey. Good morning, Mr. Orr. I'm one of a handful of members that will be asking you questions, and I'll kick it off. To the extent I ask you a question that is vague, or you think it's a trick question, it's not. I'm really trying to understand what role, if any, you played in the two major investigations in 2016, that being the investigation into what Russia did, and with whom, if anyone, did they do it, and if you know anything or had any role in the Clinton Espionage Act investigation. We want to know that too. So not trying to trick you, I just simply want to know. I've read a lot, but here's our opportunity to ask you directly, what role, if any, did you play in those two investigations, official or otherwise? Did you ever provide information to Fusion GPS employees or contractors during 2016 or 2017? I don't believe so, no. When you say you don't believe so, it makes me, as a recording lawyer, wonder why you would use that phrase instead of yes or no. I don't recall everything I said, but it's certainly not my practice. It's never been my practice to provide information to outsiders about any Department of Justice business. Gowdy. Did anyone employed at or by Fusion GPS, and by that I mean employees, contractors, anyone by any definition of employment you can think of, provide information to you in 2016 or 2017 with respect to either the Russian investigation, the investigation into what the Trump campaign did, if anything, or the Clinton investigation? Or yes, Gowdy, who? Or Chris Steele, as I understand it, was hired by Fusion GPS to do research or gather information. He provided information to me, Glenn Simpson, who is, as I understand it, a principal of Fusion GPS. On a couple of occasions, he provided information to me. And on one occasion, my wife, who was a contractor with Fusion GPS, provided some information to me. Gowdy, let's take those in reverse order. You said on one occasion your wife. And just for purposes of those who don't know, your wife's name is Nellie Orr. Is that correct? That's correct. And she began working for Fusion GPS in what? March of 2016? I believe it was late 2015. Late 2015? Yes. And what role did she have at Fusion GPS? She was a Russia analyst. She would research people and companies that Fusion GPS asked her to look into. She would do her research on the internet, open sources, and she would report her findings to Fusion GPS. Usually, I don't remember exactly the names. Was she hired specifically to work on an investigation into then-candidate Trump, or was it a broader portfolio at that time? My understanding is that it was a broader portfolio. She began, as I said, I believe in late 2015. And what did she do before she began working for Fusion GPS? She was a contractor with other companies that were doing Russia-related work. All right. If I heard you correctly, there was one occasion where she provided information to you. That is correct. What was that one occasion? At one point, and I don't remember the exact date, I think it was in 2016, she provided me with a memory stick that included research she had done for Fusion GPS on various Russian figures. And the reason she provided that information to me is, my understanding was, it related to the FBI's Russia investigation, and she gave me that stick to give to the FBI. Why would she not give it to the FBI? She wasn't talking with the FBI. She gave it to me, and I provided it to the FBI. Excuse me a second. I need to clear my throat. There we go. Thank you. Gowdy, was Chris Steele talking to the FBI? Or, at various times, Chris Steele was talking with the FBI. He was talking to them a good bit until they discharged him as a source, wasn't he? I don't know exactly when he spoke with them. Well, all marriages are different, so I'm trying to envision this cold start to a conversation with, "Here, honey, here's the thumb drive." There were no conversations before that? Well, Nellie was present with me in the end of July when I first heard Russia information relating to the Russia investigation from Chris Steele. So she was present for some of that conversation. So she was certainly aware at that point that Chris Steele was giving me some information about Russia. At some point, I don't remember when, I became aware that she was looking at some of the same figures as part of her work for Fusion GPS. And so it came up, again, I don't remember the exact date, where basically she was concerned that maybe the FBI might want her information as well, and so provided the information to me. All right? This is where I need you to help me, because you were working at the Department of Justice? Yes. Which means you, depending on what division you're working in, you have the ability, if appropriate, to charge people. Well, at the time I was working as the director of OCD ETF, so I did not have any line attorney responsibilities or chain of command responsibilities. But yes, I was working for the Department of Justice. Gowdy, right. And the Department of Justice can file informations or seek indictments. Fusion GPS cannot. So when you say you were working on the same thing, it couldn't have necessarily been for the same reasons, because she wasn't investigating criminal conduct, was she? No. What was she investigating? She was investigating names and companies that Fusion GPS asked her to look into. For what purpose? To provide it to Fusion GPS. My understanding is that Fusion GPS was, in turn, providing it to other people. Were they a contractor of the Department of Justice? Were they launching criminal investigations? No. I'm trying to figure out why Fusion GPS is investigating Russian oligarchs and potential criminality and how that might overlap with what you did at the department. My understanding is that Fusion GPS was hired by private individuals to look into possible contracts between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. See, that's what I thought. I don't know why it took us 3 questions to get there. Fusion GPS was hired by whom? I did not know at the time. Do you know now? I've seen it in the paper. It sounds like, from the paper, that there were a couple of different people that were paying Fusion GPS to do this at different times. My understanding is that some of these people were connected to the Clinton campaign in some way. I don't recall the names. So Fusion GPS were looking at potential Russian contacts with the Trump campaign. Yes. And that's what your wife was working on. Yes. At some point, I became aware that some of the people she was researching were some of the same people that I had heard about from Chris Steele and Glenn Simpson. And when did she provide, I call it a thumb drive, you called it something else. I don't recall the exact date. Give me a month. I don't recall the month either. I think it was in late 2016, but I don't know for sure. After the Russian investigation began by the Bureau, Gowdy, that would have been late July? Or I would assume it would. I'm pretty sure it was after that. After the election? That I don't recall. Well, I need you to help me there. The election is a pretty big pivot point. Most people remember what they were doing before and after that. Do you remember getting information from anyone at Fusion GPS before the election? Yes. From whom? Glenn Simpson. We'll come back to Mrs. Orr. Tell me about Glenn Simpson providing you information. Or, as I recall, and this is after checking with my notes, Mr. Simpson and I spoke in August of 2016. I met with him, and he provided some information on possible intermediaries between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Gowdy, I'm sure my colleagues are wondering this also. Why would Glenn Simpson give you information about Russian oligarchs? Well, my job for a long time included responsibility for the organized crime program at the Department of Justice. And so for many years, I had been overseeing investigations and meeting with people talking about organized crime. In the course of this many years, I had become acquainted with both Chris Steele, Glenn Simpson, and other people. And from time to time, these people would give me information about Russian oligarchs and other Russian organized crime figures, and then I would pass that to the FBI or introduce people to the FBI so that they could continue. And so what happened in August was I heard from Glenn Simpson that he had some information. Well, you also strike me as being smart enough not to make yourself a fact witness if you didn't have to. So why take the information? Chris Steele already had a relationship with the Bureau. Why not just connect Glenn Simpson with the Bureau? Why put yourself in the middle of that? Or, my recollection is that I tried to get Glenn Simpson to speak with the Bureau, but I don't recall the exact conversation. So he was willing to meet with me and give me some information. So I took the information and passed it to the FBI. Who at the FBI did you pass it on to? Well, at that point I believe I met with Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, and some people from the Justice Department's Criminal Division, and I gave them the information that I had received. Was either Peter Strzok or Lisa Page, were they working on a Russian oligarch fraud investigation in addition to the Trump campaign, or was it just the Trump campaign investigation that you remember them working on at the time? I think my recollection is they were looking at different parts, not just one part. I don't remember the exact details, but, Gowdy, can you see how it might be troubling? You just called the names of 2 people, neither of whom I think are with the Bureau, one who was mentioned unfavorably in an IG report, both of whom had, at least from my standpoint, an unprecedented amount of animus or bias towards one of the candidates, and you are getting information from someone hired by the DNC and funneling it to the lead agent on the Russia investigation. Can you possibly see how that might be troubling to people? Yes. All right. And what would your response be to that? What would your response to that troublement be? At the time, they were the people who could use, or look at the information. They were the ones that I was told to pass it to. They also told me that they would arrange for me to be in contact with a line agent, a regular agent, and that in the future, my contacts would be with that agent rather than with higher officials at the FBI. Who was handling Chris Steele? Who at the Bureau? I don't know who was officially his handler. I know one of the people he was talking with, who may have been his handler, was Special Agent Mike Gaeta. So why not tell Steele and Simpson to go talk to the Bureau directly? I believe Steele was talking to the Bureau directly. My recollection is that, at least initially, well, no, let me cancel that. I think Glenn Simpson was willing to talk with me. My recollection is I'm not sure he was willing to talk with the FBI, although that was where obviously it would be better to, Gowdy, why not? Why talk to a prosecutor who does not investigate crime? Were you assigned to the Russia investigation? Or, I was not. Sorry for all the breaks, everybody. My throat's a little raw from yesterday, so I'm sipping a lot of tea with honey to keep it going. Backing up, why not, Gowdy? Why talk to a prosecutor who does not investigate crime? Were you assigned to the Russia investigation? I was not. Did you have any connection with the Russia investigation at all? Aside from passing this information, no. So why would Glenn Simpson go through you and not go directly to the Bureau? I don't know what was in his head. I know he was willing to talk. I'm sure you asked him. I think I tried to get him to talk with the FBI, but I don't recall the exact conversation. Well, Mr. Orr, a couple of people around the table have worked for the department at various points. You really try hard, as an attorney, not to involve yourself in chains or facts that could warrant you being pretty much exactly where you are today, which is a fact witness. Surely this is not the first time you thought about that. That's right. So why allow yourself to be a conduit? Or, I wanted to get the information, whatever information they had. I wanted to get it to the FBI, and I wanted to try to create the situation for people like Glenn Simpson to talk to the FBI. Do you believe, as I do, that the FBI is the world's premier law enforcement agency? If I say yes, I might make people at the DEA very unhappy. But yes, I have a great admiration for the FBI. Gowdy, I don't think it's going to make them unhappy. They just don't have as much jurisdiction as the Bureau has. The Bureau has broad jurisdiction. I mean, the DEA can't look at Title 18 cases, can they? Or, that's right, except for money laundering, I believe, yes. Gowdy, all right. So you've got what? With your caveat noted, you don't want to offend anybody else. You've got the world's premier law enforcement agency investigating a fact pattern. Chris Steele already has a handler, already is in contact with the FBI, and you allow the person hired by the DNC to dig up dirt on a presidential candidate to talk to you directly and use you as a conduit. We're just trying to figure out why you let that happen. I took the information. I thought the information might be important, and I wanted to get it to the FBI. It seemed the only way to do it. What information would Glenn Simpson have that the Bureau couldn't get or already have? I don't know exactly what the FBI had access to, and I know Glenn Simpson was also gathering information, so more information is better. The FBI is in a position to decide whether the information is useful or credible. My job, as I saw it, was just to get the information over there and let them figure it out. So when Glenn Simpson gave you information, what information did he give you? I don't recall the exact facts he gave me in August. I believe I made some notes at the time, and I believe it had to do with the possible intermediaries between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Such as? I don't recall the exact names. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Orr, yes. To allege that a hostile foreign government is in cahoots with members of a campaign is a pretty serious allegation. Yes, and you don't remember who it was. There were many names mentioned over a period of time. Tell me the ones you remember. I don't know if it came up in the conversation with Glenn Simpson, but certainly one of them was Sergei Milyan. How about on the Trump campaign side? Again, I don't recall if this was a name that Glenn Simpson mentioned, but I remember the name Michael Cohen coming up. Cohen. Okay. Who else? I remember, and again, I don't remember if. I think this name came from Chris Steele originally, was Carter Page. And the name Paul Manafort was also mentioned, and I think that came from Chris Steele originally. Gowdy. And what precisely, as you best can recall, was the nature of this collaboration, conspiracy, coordination? That there were communications back and forth between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. Is there anything inherently criminal about that? If the Russian government was attempting to influence the Trump campaign in some way, I would think that would be a national security threat. What would that some way be? Espousing certain positions, or if they had some kind of control or influence over members of the campaign that could affect U.S. policy in a way that would be favorable to Russia or Russian interests. And what did Mr. Simpson relay to you about that? What control or dominion or? I think Mr. Simpson what Glenn Simpson was giving me was more the means by which this communication was being, what he thought how the communication was happening. I don't think he was talking as much about what exactly they were, what policies or whatever they were talking about. You've been a prosecutor for how long? I began as a prosecutor in 1991. So from 2018 to 91, you have essentially asked questions for a living. Yes. What questions did you ask Glenn Simpson about the origin of his information? And maybe it's just me, I'm still struggling to figure out. Now, if it was a conspiracy to access the DNC server, I'm interested. If it's a conspiracy to access John Podesta's email, I'm interested. Because you need a conspiracy to figure out a password of Obama 08. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. I'm actually interested if it's a conspiracy to disseminate what was taken even if they didn't take it. But I doubt he met with a high-ranking DOJ official to say someone in the Russian government knows someone in the Trump campaign. Or, I believe one of the things, again, I don't remember if it was Glenn Simpson or Chris Steele. That mentioned this, talked about, I'm going to get the names wrong, but somebody associated with the Trump campaign having advanced knowledge of when information about the Clinton campaign that had been stolen and hacked, when it was going to be leaked. Gowdy, what criminal code section would that violate? Or, I think again, it's conspiracy to defraud the United States? Right, conspiracy. It could be, Gowdy, you don't see that statute used very often, I don't think, do you? Not that part of it. Recently we've seen it. Sorry? Recently we've seen it. Is that what you were thinking, that it was a conspiracy to defraud the United States? I think any attempt by a foreign power to gain influence over a presidential campaign would be troubling. But that does not include Steele relying on Russians to provide dirt on Trump. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. That does not include Steele relying on Russians to provide dirt on Trump? Question mark. I think my understanding is that what Steele was finding out was investigating the links, the national security threat posed by the Russian government officials attempting to gain influence over the Trump campaign. So I don't think that's criminal. I think that's highlighting a national security threat. He was relying on foreign nationals for that information? I don't know who he was getting it from. Who were Steele's sources? I don't know. How did you vet those? How did he vet those sources? How did Fusion GPS vet those sources? I don't know the specifics. The fact that my wife was looking at some of the same figures, like Sergei Milian, suggests that there was one way they were trying to vet the information. So when I provided it to the FBI, I tried to be clear that this is source information. I don't know how reliable it is. You're going to have to check it out and be aware. These guys were hired by somebody who's related to the Clinton campaign, and be aware, Gowdy, did you tell the Bureau that? Or, oh yes. Why did you tell the Bureau that? I wanted them to be aware of any possible bias, or, as they evaluate the information, they need to know the circumstances. So there you have it. This was one of the big takeaways from the Orr testimony, I remember when it was released, that he constantly, or at least consistently, told the FBI, this information is source information. It's not verified. It came from a political campaign, or an outreach of a political campaign. This guy, I think he mentions later, this guy has a hard-on for Trump. He could not stand to see him elected. He brought this to the FBI's attention, And the FBI instead ran full forward with this information and used it as a major portion of their first attempt and then subsequently successful attempts to get a FISA warrant against Carter Page so they could listen in on him and all his conversations electronically. The FBI knew, according to Bruce Orr. Back up a little bit. Why did you tell the Bureau that? I wanted them to be aware of any possible bias or, as they evaluate the information, they need to know the circumstances. So you specifically told the Bureau that the information you were passing on came from someone who was employed by the DNC, albeit in somewhat a triangulated way. Or, I don't believe I didn't know they were employed by the DNC. Let me fix this. But I certainly said, yes, that they were working for, they were somehow working associated with the Clinton campaign. And I also told the FBI that my wife worked for Fusion GPS, or was a contractor for Fusion GPS. Gowdy. And again, you thought it was important to tell the Bureau that for bias, or yes, Gowdy, motive, interest in the outcome, all of the reasons you have to produce, or yes, Gowdy, not complementary information, or yes, Gowdy. And so you think it should have also been included in a FISA application. I don't do FISA applications. I don't know. So I think you should attempt to corroborate any source information you get before you, Gowdy. Would a jury be told about that? Or I think certainly I would. If I were calling a witness, I would provide that kind of information to the defense. Well, and your very competent counsel would spend hours making sure the jury knew of the connection between the source and a political opponent, don't you think? Hours. I'm sure it would be a topic of cross-examination. It wouldn't be a footnote. Or, Gowdy, it wouldn't be an oblique footnote buried somewhere in an application. They'd spend hours on it. Or, I'm sure if it were a trial setting, there would be cross-examination about it. All right. So, Simpson, you met with Simpson how many times? I recall 2 times. Now, some of my colleagues don't believe in coincidences. I have not made up my mind yet on whether or not that's possible, but you met with with Steele, if I recall correctly, in late July. Or, yes. Gowdy, at a breakfast with Mrs. Orr? Yes. Do you know what else happened in late July? I have seen in the papers that the FBI opened some kind of investigation in late July. I was certainly not aware of that at the time. Who opened it? I've just seen something in the papers. I don't know. Oh, you can guess. What FBI agent opened it? Or, I don't know. Gowdy, I'll give you a little hint. You mentioned his name already. Peter Strzok. How many times did you talk to Peter Strzok before July of 2016? None, I don't think. I did not know Peter Strzok. How did you meet him? At some point, I believe in the fall of 2016, I met with him and Lisa Page, as I told you before. Why? Why did you meet with them? To pass the latest information that I had received. How did you find out who to meet with? Who did you call to find out? So, prior to that meeting, after the July 30th meeting with Chris Steele, I wanted to provide the information he had given me to the FBI. I reached out for Andrew McCabe, at that time Deputy Director of the FBI, and somebody who had previously led the Russian organized crime squad in New York, and who I had worked with in the past, and asked if he could meet with me. I went to his office to provide the information, and Lisa Page was there. So I provided the information to them. At some point after that, I think I was given Peter Strzok, or somehow put in contact with Peter Strzok. And that would have been when? I don't recall the exact date. I'm guessing it would have been in August, since I met with Chris Steele at the end of July, and I'm pretty sure I've reached out to Andrew McCabe soon afterwards. So you provided the information Glenn Simpson gave to you to Peter Strzok. No. The information Chris Steele had given me. Oh, no. Yes, yeah, I'm sorry. So after Glenn Simpson gave me information, yes, I believe I provided that to Peter Strzok. So the Steele and Simpson information, you were the conduit to Peter Strzok. Yes, they may have had other conduits, certainly, with respect to Mr. Steele, but yes, I did. In July of 2016, Chris Steele emailed you and and made references to, and I'll quote, our favorite business tycoon. Yes. Who was he referring to? Oleg Deripaska. How did you know that's who he was referring to? We had had a conversation prior to that time about Oleg Deripaska earlier that year. Could it have been Donald Trump? No, I don't think so. Why not? We never had conversations about Donald Trump before July 30th. He talked with me about Russian organized crime matters. We had talked in the past about Deripaska. That was pretty much the only person in my mind that he could have been referring to. Did you and Chris Steele ever discuss Donald Trump? In the July 30th conversation, one of the items of information that Chris Steele gave to me was that he had information that a former head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, had stated to someone, I don't know who, that they had Donald Trump over a barrel. Did you know John Weiner? Yes, I'm acquainted with Jonathan Weiner. Did you ever discuss the Russian investigation or the 2016 presidential race with John Weiner? No. Did you ever pass information? He was an employee of the State Department? I think so. Did you ever pass information from him onto the Bureau or the Department? No. Other than Chris Steele and Glenn Simpson, did anyone else ever provide information to you that you then provided to the Department or the Bureau? I mentioned my wife and the memory stick. Your wife. So I don't think anyone else did. No. Did you look at that stick or thumb drive? No. You didn't even open it? No. I didn't want to plug it into my machine at work. I just gave it to the FBI. Well, that's pretty smart. Why didn't you want to plug it into your machine at work? I don't plug any stick that anyone gives me, even my wife, into a work computer. Again, when I was working IT, if more people were that wary of data, just shoving it into their computer or opening a file that they weren't sure about, I probably wouldn't have had a job because they wouldn't have needed me to put out all those fires. Gowdy, what did she describe was on it, the thumb drive? Or, my understanding was that it included her research on behalf of Fusion GPS. Was her job to find as much information as she could, good, bad, on Donald Trump, or was it opposition research? I don't think. My understanding was not that. She was asked to look at specific individuals and companies, and I think they were all related to Russia because her expertise was researching Russian topics, reading Russian websites, that sort of thing. So I think she was just gathering whatever information she could find on those persons, and then she would pass that to Fusion GPS. So it wasn't limited to favorable or unfavorable. It was just whatever she could find. Gowdy, the July 30 breakfast that Chris Steele and your wife you attended, what was discussed there? So Chris Steele provided me with basically 3 items of information. One of them I've described to you already, the comment that information supposedly stated and made by the former head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. He also mentioned that Carter Page had met with certain high-level Russian officials when he was in Moscow. Not a crime. My recollection is at that time the name Carter Page had already been in the press, and there had been some kind of statement about who he had met with when he went to Moscow. And so the first item that I recall Chris Steele telling me was he had had information that Carter Page met with higher-level Russian officials, not just whoever was mentioned in the press article. So that was one item. And then the third item he mentioned was that Paul Hauser, who was an attorney working for Oleg Deripaska, had information about Paul Manafort, that Manafort had entered into some kind of business deal with Oleg Deripaska, had stolen a large amount of money from Oleg Deripaska, and that Paul Hauser was trying to gather information that would show that, or give more detail about what Paul Manafort had done with respect to Deripaska. Hey, Jason, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate that. Glad that you're here. If anything comes up that you aren't happy with, that you need to give me some advice on, just shout it right out, and I'll make sure to take care of it immediately. Really glad you're here. And just so you know, I know you weren't here earlier for it, but my technical director, Picasso knows, who's in the chat, or at least was earlier, she's now been promoted to executive producer. So give her a round of applause if you get a chance. Just to add the last, or to finish that last sentence from or gather information that would show that, or give more detail about what Paul Manafort had done with respect to Deripaska. Gowdy, did Steele ever express his opinion on candidate Trump to you? Or, at that time, I don't recall, but later on, prior to the election, when I spoke with Chris Steele, I got the sense he was very alarmed by this information, which I think he believed to be true. So I definitely got the impression he did not want Donald Trump to win the election. You got the impression, or he told you that? I don't remember specifically what he said, but it was a strong enough impression that I told the FBI that. Have you had a chance to review your 302s? I looked at my 302s in preparation for my testimony with the Senate Intelligence Committee back in January of this year, and I did review them on one subsequent occasion, again, early this year. So I have seen them, but I have not looked at them for at least 6 months. Do you recall whether it was you that Chris Steele said he was desperate that Donald Trump not win? I think I said that to the FBI, yes. Was that your impression of him, or is that something he said to you? I don't recall exactly what he said, but, as I said, whether he said it directly or not, I had the very strong impression. I just don't want to say words that I don't remember right at this moment. What does the word desperate mean? I think he was very anxious or very, very concerned that Donald Trump not win. Well, concerned and desperate are two separate words. What does the word desperate mean? I think very concerned, and again, I wanted to provide that to the FBI because it was important that the FBI know what his mindset was. You want to know when, Gowdy. If you're relying on a source that says they're desperate to prevent someone from winning, you would want to know that. Or, yes, of course, Gowdy. How about willing to do anything to keep him from winning? Do you remember seeing that in your 302 or words to that effect? No, I don't recall that specifically, no. Well, what do you... Instead of me guessing what you recall, what do you recall Chris Steele telling you about Donald Trump and whether or not he wanted to see him prevail in November? As I told you, I don't recall the exact words. I definitely had a very strong impression that he did not want Donald Trump to win because he believed his information he was giving me was accurate, and that he was, as I said, very concerned, or he was desperate, which is what I then told the FBI. Now I'm curious, Chris Steele, according to Orr here, said that he believed his information was accurate, but since then he's testified in court that he would not stand behind his dossier and would give, I believe, a 50-50 chance of some of the information or all of the information in it being correct, at best. So when did that change, Chris? When did you go from being rock solid, this is good stuff, to I wouldn't stand behind it? I'd be curious about that. Gowdy, if I remember right, you've been a prosecutor since 1991? Yes, sir. Did you ever have a chance to cross-examine anyone? On occasion, not as often as a defense counsel, but yes. So tell me all the questions, cross-examination-like questions, that you asked Chris Steele about the source of his information. I knew he would not give me the source of his information, so I couldn't get it. How much of what Chris Steele told you would have ever come out in a courtroom? I'm not sure it would have. Gowdy, or this was source information. I'm pretty sure it would not. Or, right. Gowdy, why not? Or, it was source information. It was hearsay. Gowdy, what's hearsay? It's something that he did not. It was something that he heard from someone else. What is hearsay for those not familiar with the definition? A statement that was made outside of court. Offered to prove? The truth of the matter asserted. Yes. Yes. Gowdy, there are exceptions, but we can't find one for what Chris Steele told you. Was Chris Steele talking directly to the source? I don't know exactly. I assumed he was talking to a source. I don't know what the source specifically knew. Did he have sub-sources? I don't know. I'm guessing you never talked to the sources or sub-sources. That is correct. Well, Mr. Orr, that information would never see the inside of a courtroom, because you can't cross-examine it. You can't find out who, if anyone, really is the source of that. Do you agree? Yes. But this is not evidence in a courtroom. He is providing information from... This is source information, and most FBI investigations involve source information, at least in the early stages. Gowdy. All right. I don't really want to do this, but we're going to have to do it anyway. Why would that information not come in a courtroom? Why is hearsay not allowed? Or, we don't. The rules of evidence are try to ensure that we have, first-person evidence for a courtroom. Why? Why? Because we consider that more reliable. Yes, it's more reliable, more likely to be true, right? Yes. And the most powerful tool you have to eliminate the truth is what? I'll give you a hint. It's in the Sixth Amendment. Or cross-examination. Gowdy. You get to confront the people, right? You get to cross them. Yes. Not only were you not able to do it, you don't even know if Steele was able to do it. Right. So best case scenario, it's double hearsay. Worst case scenario, we don't have any. It could be quintuple hearsay, right? Or I don't know. It definitely is hearsay, and it was source information, which is what I was telling the FBI. I like the phrase source information. Source information is of no help if the source is not credible. Agree? The FBI, I agree, but what the FBI has to do when it gets information is see if there's other information from other places that corroborate the information. And this is the point of giving. That's why the FBI collects source information, not to present it in court, but to see if different sources corroborate each other and whether a picture begins to emerge. Gowdy. I guess what alarms me about this fact pattern is all the way in December of 2016, a guy named Comey was referring to the information as unverified. That's in December of 2016. What happened in October of 2016? I'm not sure what you're referring to. Was it used in a court filing? I'm not aware of how it was used. Have you read the FISA application? Or, I'm aware that I've read in the paper that some kind of a FISA application was used, or that some of the information was used in a FISA application, but I was not aware of that at the time. Were you aware that Director Comey referred to the information as unverified all the way into December of 2016? I don't recall that, at the time, but I certainly considered it, as I said, source information. Do you know what steps Peter Strzok took to either corroborate or contradict the information? No. So you don't know Steele's source. Correct. You don't know if he had sub-sources. Correct. You don't know if any of it was even attempted to be corroborated or contradicted. My assumption is that the FBI tries to corroborate the information if they think it's something they want to pursue. How would you know better than Comey? He said it was unverified. They didn't even try to corroborate it until 2017. I don't know what they were doing. Who at the department knew that you were talking to Chris Steele and Glenn Simpson? I spoke with some people in the criminal division, other career officials who dealt with some of these matters. So, any of them have names? Yes, so I was about to tell you. One of them was Bruce Swartz, who was the counselor for international affairs in the criminal division. A person who was working with him at the time, working on similar matters in the criminal division, was Zainab Ahmad, something like that. And a third person who was working on some of these matters, I believe, was Andrew Weissman. Ah, good old Andrew Weissman. Mueller's pit bull. Mr. Gowdy, who was that last one? Or Andrew Weissman. He was the head of the fraud section at the time. I've heard his name somewhere before, I think. Gowdy. Changing the subject, have you talked to anyone on the special counsel's team? Or, I've had one social contact with a member of the special counsel team, an FBI agent who I've worked with in the past, named Bill McCausland, was, at least for a while, assigned to the special counsel team from New York. When he was working in Washington, we went out for lunch one time. We did not discuss the investigation. Other than that, I'm not aware of any contact with the special counsel team. Did you ever put Chris Steele in touch with anyone on the special counsel team? I don't know. I know that the FBI at one point in 2017 asked me to ask Chris if he would meet with the FBI, and I conveyed that message. And I know at some point a meeting took place. I don't know who from the FBI was present, so I don't know if they were from the special counsel team or not. I'm going to have to get you to go back through that again. You lost me, which I'm sure is my fault, not yours. No, sorry. I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat the question so I get it right. Well, what I think I was wondering is whether or not Chris Steele either asked you or communicated to you that he wanted to talk to special counsel team and whether you made any efforts to connect him. Okay, that's a different question. But I know that Chris Steele referred to the FBI and the special counsel team in some of our conversations, it seemed like interchangeably. I do not know who Chris Steele spoke with when the FBI spoke with him in 2017, so I don't know if the FBI people who spoke with him were a part of the special counsel's team or not. The person I was speaking with when I reported these conversations was not part of the special counsel team. Are you aware that Chris Steele's relationship with the Bureau soured and or dissolved at some point in the fall of 2016? At some point I became aware of that, yes. How did you learn that? I'm not sure when I first learned of it. I certainly would have heard that from Chris Steele at some point, but I'm not sure when I learned it first. Why did it dissolve? I don't know specifically. I'm sure Chris told you, didn't he? Or did you not ask? I mean, I guess I was making an assumption at the time that, but it's just an assumption, that the FBI would have stopped talking with him because he talked to a reporter. Why would that dissolve a relationship with the Bureau? Normally, the FBI tells its sources not to talk to anybody else. That would be a good assumption. So Chris Steele was working for Fusion GPS and the FBI at the same time? Yes, I believe so. Was he being paid by both? I believe so. Why was the Bureau paying for him for information if you were going to pass it on from Fusion GPS to the Bureau? I know the FBI had other contacts with Chris Steele besides my contact, besides what I was getting, but I don't know the specific nature of what they paid him for. Did you ever talk to the media? No. Did DAG Yates know that you were talking to Steele or Simpson? No. Did any of your supervisors at the department know? I think the others you described were more peers. Or, right. Yowdy. Any of your supervisors? No. Do you know if Mrs. Nellie Orr ever talked to Peter Strzok? I don't know of any conversation. No. If there were a text from Strzok to Page that said, quote, remind me, redacted, name, redacted, met with Bruce and got more stuff today, close quote, do you know who that Bruce would be? No. Could it be Bruce Orr? I guess it could be. Do you remember meeting with someone on or about December 20th and getting information from that person? Not as I sit here. Would anything refresh your recollection? Maybe an email or something, I don't know. I don't think in my notes it's reflected anything like that. If I remember correctly, the only sources of information for you were Simpson, Steele, and Mrs. Orr. Yes. Outside the government? Yes. What was that last part? Outside the government? Yes. All right. Other than Mrs. Orr, were you talking to the other two in December of 2016? I believe I met with Glenn Simpson in December 2016. About what? He provided me with a memory stick, and he provided additional information regarding the contacts between the Russians and the Trump campaign. So now we're up to 2 memory sticks. Yes. Both of whom could have gone to the Bureau, but didn't. Oh, I provided them to the Bureau. I get that, Mr. Orr. I'm still wondering why they wanted to go through a DOJ attorney that was not assigned to the investigation. Well, I've known Glenn Simpson, not very well, but I've known him for several years. So maybe he felt more comfortable talking with me. That's my assumption, but man, jeez. Glenn Simpson felt more comfortable talking with someone completely outside the scope of the FBI to feed the FBI information about an ongoing investigation. That doesn't raise any red flags whatsoever. Jason, you're right. This is crazy stuff. Orr's last sentence. That's my assumption. But Gowdy, you've been with the department since '91? Yes, sir. Are there other cases where you recall taking information from fact witnesses and passing it on to the Bureau? Yes. I don't recall specific instances, but over the years, as I've talked with people who are, experts or have information one way or another on transnational organized crime, including Russian organized crime, I take their information, and if it looked like it, if there's anything there, I would pass it to the FBI. Gowdy: I've been out of it for about 8 years, so you help me if I'm wrong, but a stick or a thumb drive would be physical evidence, yes, sir, for which a chain would exist, yes, if it were ever needed in court, right. And you made yourself part of the chain? Yes. Can you think of other instances in your career since '91 where you made yourself part of a chain of custody? I don't remember getting any other sticks or anything like that, so how many cases would you say you handled in your career at the department? When I was in AUSA and actively prosecuting cases, I'm sure I did a few hundred. Then if tradition holds, you did a few less when you went to main justice than when you were out in the field. Yes. So what? 250? Is that conservative? I wouldn't want to guess. Gowdy: I want to be conservative. 200? As I said, I'm sure it was, several hundred altogether. Several hundred would be more than 200, but we'll be really conservative and say 200. All right? And you can't think of a single case where you inserted yourself into a chain of custody other than this one. That's right. I guess my colleagues are wondering why. Why this one? As I mentioned before, I met people over the years who would have information that they wanted to tell somebody in U.S. law enforcement. I had been working in this area for many years, so many people know me but might not know an FBI agent who's working in this area. They would tell me things, I would pass it to the FBI. Dude, if they didn't know an FBI agent who's working in this area, you could look it up and get them together. Why would you take that information and pass it on directly? Some of these, and I don't know all the ins and outs of this. I'm just reading this for the first time. But Orr and Strzok and Page, sometimes these people don't strike me as being the brightest bulb in the marquee. Gowdy: you never gave information to your wife to then give to Fusion GPS? No. No. Did you ever have any conversations with Peter Strzok about Donald Trump? I don't believe so. No. What causes you not to be certain? Well, I passed him the information I had received, so that's, so that information mentions Donald Trump's name, but outside of that, I don't think we had any other conversations. Now 10:05 a.m. We are right on time. Gowdy: did he ever express any animus or bias towards Trump to you in those conversations? I don't think so, no. Did you ever meet with Lisa Page? She was at the same meeting. She was at the meeting with Peter Strzok, and she was at the initial meeting with Andrew McCabe. Where did the meeting take place, the one with you and Strzok and Page? I believe that was in the criminal division at Main Justice. Did either one of them express any concern that you were in a chain of physical evidence? Well, at that point, I don't believe that any memory sticks had been passed. So they understood that I had received information, and they said they would get me an agent to talk to who would write the stuff down and do whatever. Well, I don't know if he writes it down, but that they would give me an agent to speak with and provide the information. Is that why there are 302s of you in the file? And remember, 302s are the summaries of notes or notes that are the summary of a discussion with anyone that an FBI agent would talk to regarding a case, whether it was a witness or something like that. The form is listed. The form is numbered 302. There's a prefix in front of it, but I can't remember what that is. So when they refer to 302s, they're referring to those notes about interviews. Gowdy: is that why there are 302s of you in the file? I believe so. Is that the agent interviewing you? Yes. Who did you give the sticks to? The agent. Yes. Which agent? I believe at this point it was Joe Pientka. Did you get a receipt? No. No chain of custody receipt? This was, unverified, as you say. It was source information. I just passed it to the FBI for whatever it was worth. Why did you meet with Chris Steele after the FBI had dissolved its relationship with him? I don't believe I met with Chris Steele at any point after that. Chris Steele would continue to call at various times, and I would listen to what he had to say, and I would pass it to the FBI. The only time information went the other way, it wasn't information, was when the FBI asked me to convey to Chris would he be willing to meet with them again, and I did that. Who at the FBI asked whether Steele would be willing to meet with them again? It was the agent I was talking to. At that point, I don't remember if it was Joe Pienka or another agent. At various times, I was told to start talking to a new agent until I would provide the information to the new agent. So this is after the Bureau dissolved its relationship with Steele? I believe so, yes. Did not pay him the last installment of the money he thought he was owed? I believe so, yes. For breaking the agreement that he had with them not to tell others that he was a Bureau source and or talking to the media. That is my assumption, but yes, I was not part of any decision at the FBI, so I don't know specifically, but that is my understanding. And your testimony as someone at the Bureau was willing to re-engage with Christopher Steele. Yes. And tell me again who that was? I don't know where the request came from. It was given to me by the agent that I was reporting to, and then I conveyed that to Chris Steele. Gowdy, did you ever wonder why the Bureau didn't convey that directly to Steele, why the Bureau was also using you as a conduit? I don't remember if I wondered about that at the time. I guess it didn't seem out of place, since I was telling them, hey, this is what he told me. And they said, oh well, the next time you talk with him, can you ask him this? And so I did. Gowdy, I have only got a little bit of time left. I see Mr. Ratcliffe writing furiously, so he can have the 1 minute and 30 seconds I have left. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Orr, I want to make sure I heard you right. You met with Lisa Page on 2 occasions that you, or I remember 2. There might have been a third, but I remember 2. Ratcliffe. And one of those was shortly after you met with Christopher Steele. On July 30th, you had a meeting with Andy McCabe and Lisa Page. Yes. You said that meeting was at Main Justice? No, that meeting was in Andrew McCabe's office. It was in Andrew McCabe's office. Yes. And it was sometime, you believe, in August, because it was shortly after the meeting with Christopher Steele. Probably, yes. And that was because at that point in time, you wanted the FBI to have that information and be aware of your contact with Christopher Steele. Yes. Did anyone prompt that call to Andy McCabe? No, I don't think so. I think that was me, just me. You, out of just an idea that that was an appropriate thing to do? Yes. Okay, but you also thought it was appropriate to be communicating with Christopher Steele? Yes. Okay, even though you don't have any authority, apparently. He's just calling me or meeting with me, as we had done on and off for many years. So if he tells me something that is of interest or concern, I pass that to the FBI. Ratcliffe. And you said something about you thought that was your job. Yes, part of my job, as I saw it, as having been for a long time responsible for organized crime at the department, was to try to gather as much information or introduce the FBI to possible sources of information, whatever ways to further the program's goals. Yeah, what indeed? And let me make sure I know what you're referring to there, Jason, because I'm pretty sure you're pinging to the thing that just almost blew the top of my head off, but I kind of let it go because I was reading quickly. I believe you're referring to, he is just calling me or meeting with me, as we had done on and off for many years. So if he tells me something that is of interest or concern, I pass that to the FBI. If that, again, I think I said this earlier, if this makes sense to anybody, please let me know. I don't know how the FBI works. I don't know how the DOJ works. But for God's sakes, folks, this is insane stuff. Let me repeat Mr. Orr's statement. Yes, part of my job as I saw it, as having been for a long time responsible for organized crime at the department, was to try to gather as much information or introduce the FBI to possible sources of information, whatever ways to further the program's goals. Ratcliffe: okay, but yet Sally Yates, she was your boss, right? Yes. You said she didn't know that you were talking to Steele or Simpson. Correct. How do you know she didn't know? Well, I didn't tell her. Okay. She may have known from other sources. Possible. Well, you would think she would, because over at the FBI, Andy McCabe knew that you were talking to Steele and Simpson as early as August of 2016. Right. But I don't know what, if anything, was conveyed to Sally Yates. Andy McCabe knew. Did Jim Comey know in August of 2016 that you were talking to Christopher Steele and Glenn Simpson? I don't know. I think our first hour has expired, so I will visit with you in a little bit. Or, okay. Now there's a recess. They come back on the record at 10:25. And we start with Ms. Shen. Sir, my name is Valerie Shen. I am the Chief National Security Counsel for Ranking Member Cummings on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. So now we're getting into the Democrat questioning. Ms. H. Ira H. for Ranking Member Nadler. Ms. Shen. She will be leading the questioning on behalf of the minority side today. Or, good morning. Shen, good morning. Now we get into Ms. Shen's questioning. Now in this section, it's going to be Q referring to Ms. Shen and A referring to or. So I may mix up from time to time saying either Q, A, or Shen, but that's how this is formatted, so I'll try to keep it as straight as possible. Ms. Shen. So I would like to ask you just some additional background questions about your career. So we will end up covering, I think, some of the ground that we mentioned last round. But what is your current title at the Department of Justice? I am a senior counsel in the Office of International Affairs in the Criminal Division of the Justice Department. And how long have you held that position? Since January of this year. And how would you describe your general roles and responsibilities in that position? I advise the Director and Deputy Directors of the Office of International Affairs in the operation of the office and the work of the office. Who is currently your direct supervisor? The Director of Office of International Affairs is Vaughn Airy, A-R-Y. And who does Vaughn Airy report to? He reports to the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Bruce Schwartz, and to the Assistant Attorney General. And who does that Assistant Attorney General report to? The Deputy Attorney General, who reports to the Attorney General. Correct. What previous positions have you held at DOJ? What was your previous position before your current one? Excuse me. My previous position was the Director of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, or OCDETF. OCDETF. Even he can't keep it straight. What was your role and responsibilities as part of that position? I was the head of that component responsible for the operation of OCDETF and helping to coordinate drug and organized crime investigations within the department. And how long did you hold that position for? I had that position from late 2014 until January of 2018, the current year. And when you were in that position, who did you directly report to? I reported to the Deputy Attorney General. What was your position at the Department of Justice prior to the Director of OCDETF? From 2011 to 2014, I was Counselor for Transnational Organized Crime and International Affairs in the Criminal Division. And what were your roles and responsibilities as part of that position? I worked on organized crime policy matters and on international policy and case matters as they came up. And who did you report to when you were in that position? To Bruce Schwartz and to the Assistant Attorney General. And what position did you hold at the Department of Justice before you were the Counselor for Transnational Organized Crime and International Affairs? Lady, why not just ask him to hand over his CV? Scan it and get it over with. What the hell? I mentioned this yesterday. I don't know if I mentioned it during the Lisa Page readings. I may well have, but still, it seems like the Democrat questioning, more often than not, is designed to waste time. The Republican questioning is dealing with hard facts. Not saying that Republicans don't repeat themselves. Yesterday that happened quite often, but not as incredibly vague and, vague, 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 and demoralizingly boring as it is with the Democratic questioning. And I think we're seeing that repeat itself today. Shen. And what position did you hold at the Department of Justice before you were the Counselor for Transnational Organized Crime and International Affairs? From 1999 to 2011, I was the Chief of the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section in the Criminal Division. And what were your roles and responsibilities in that position? I oversaw the Department of Justice's organized crime program, primarily transnational organized crime. And who did you report to as part of that position? I reported to one of the Deputy Assistant Attorney Generals in the Criminal Division. For most of the time that I was the chief of that section, I reported to Deputy Assistant Attorney General John Keeney, Keeney. And what was your position at the Department of Justice prior to that position? From 91 to 99, I was Assistant U.S. Attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. And what types of cases did you prosecute when you were in the SDNY? Many different kinds of cases. I served in the General Crimes Unit, the Narcotics Unit, Senior Narcotics Unit, Securities Unit, the Gang Unit, and in my last year in the office, I was the Chief of the Violent Gang Unit. I'm so sorry about the chair, folks. There's nothing I can do. I just try to hold still. Q. As part of the Chief of the Violent Gang Unit, are there any particular cases you found notable, or can you just elaborate a little bit more on your work as the Chief of the Violent Gangs Unit? Jason writes, agreed. They actually don't want real answers. They want to provide safe havens and leading questions that make his actions not so bad, like Cohen. Exactly. Absolutely exactly. Perfectly put. Or can you just elaborate a little bit more about your work as the Chief of the Violent Gangs Unit? Our job was to prosecute the most violent gangs in New York City. We did provide numerous prosecutions for murder, racketeering, drugs of violent gangs in various parts of New York City. Are you a counterintelligence expert? No. Have you ever worked as a counterintelligence professional? No. What would you say your professional areas of expertise are? I have worked most of my career in organized crime and drug investigations. How many years of experience do you have in organized crime? Certainly the time I was chief of the organized crime section, 12 years. I worked some organized crime cases when I was in AUSA. Then as counselor, well, I would say everything since then has involved organized crime. So it would be fair to say you have decades of experience in organized crime. Yes. Are there certain nations or regions of organized crime that you have had a special focus on in your career? Yes. We are concerned with organized crime from many different regions. Russia and the former Soviet Union is one. Eastern Europe and the Balkans is another. Asian organized crime and emerging organized crime groups from other parts of the world as well. So would you call yourself an expert in Russian organized crime? Yes. And as part of your work in Russian organized crime, have you worked on cases involving the Russian mafia or mob? I'm not sure what the correct terminology is. Yes, I have overseen those kinds of investigations. I'm sorry, that's not what it said, but I'll read it verbatim. Yes, I have seen those kind of investigation is. Q. And in your investigations involving the Russia mafia or mob, what types of investigations or crimes do those tend to involve? They often involve fraud, public corruption, extortion, money laundering, other crimes. Do those criminal investigations sometimes involve Russian oligarchs? Yes. Have you ever prosecuted a Russian oligarch? One of the cases that I had some supervisory responsibility as the chief of the organized crime section was the prosecution of a former prime minister of Ukraine named Pavlo Lazarenko. He was not only a former prime minister, but he had a great deal of money, so I suppose you could call him an oligarch. Was Pavlo Lazarenko, what kind of criminal activity was he engaged in? I believe we charged him with money laundering and fraud. Can you describe in a little bit more detail what your specific role was in the prosecution of Pavlo Lazarenko? Why? Not wasting any time, are we? Or, the prosecution of Lazarenko was carried out by the San Francisco Strike Force. which was in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California. As the chief of the organized crime section in Washington, we had some supervisory responsibility for all strike force investigations. And why is his case specifically notable to you? He was an extremely prominent figure both politically and having a lot of money in Ukraine. The case involved corruption on a very large scale, theft of Ukraine government monies. He came to the United States, so it was a very long and drawn-out prosecution. How long was the prosecution, do you recall? I don't remember exactly, but it was several years. As part of the prosecution of Pavlo Lazarenko, were there other individuals who were also prosecuted in related crimes? Yes, there was another defendant in California. I believe his name may have been Karachenko, but I am not sure. Was that individual a U.S. citizen or a Russian national? I don't recall. Do you recall playing a role in the 2003 indictment of the Russian crime boss Semyon Mogilevich? Yes. Okay, and can you describe what your role was in that prosecution? Again, as the chief of the organized crime section, we had some supervisory responsibility for the work of the Philadelphia strike force that invited Semyon Mogilevich. I don't recall now whether there was a RICO charge. I believe there was in that case, and we had independent responsibility to review and approve all RICO indictments before they were filed. Do you recall generally what types of crimes Semyon Mogilevich was involved in? He was involved in stock manipulation, if I remember correctly. Do you recall the revocation of Russian oligarchs Oleg Deripaska's visa around 2006? Yes, yes. There have been different incidents involving Mr. Deripaska over the years, so I may have trouble remembering specifically what happened in 2006, but yes. I guess I will go to the beginning. What is sort of your earliest recollection of your official involvement in prosecution or activity involving Oleg Deripaska? I don't recall my first exposure to matters involving Mr. Deripaska, but I do recall that at some point, it may have been in 2006, I worked with the FBI and with other U.S. government agencies to try to limit Mr. Deripaska's access to the United States. And why did yourself and the FBI believe Mr. Deripaska's access to the United States should be limited at that time? Mr. Weisenheimer. I'm sorry, that's not right. That's Weinsheimer. He really can't get into other investigations and the basis for that investigation. Shen. Okay. Ms. Shen continues. Can you describe, as a more general matter, why Mr. Oleg Deripaska was on the United States government radar? I can say generally that Mr. Deripaska's activities have been of concern to the U.S. government for some time. So, overall, would it be fair to say that you have significant experience in investigating and prosecuting Russian organized crime, including Russian oligarchs with connections to the Russian government? Yes. Yes, well put, Picasso knows. At least his name did come up previously, so there is some basis for this questioning. A very, in my opinion, tenuous basis, but at least there's a commonality there. Thank you for pointing that out. Mr. Orr, why did you decide to join the Justice Department? I wanted to prosecute cases. I believe strongly in the mission of the Department of Justice to protect our American citizens by investigating and prosecuting crime. That is what I wanted to do. And in your nearly 3 decades at the Justice Department, what would you call your proudest accomplishment? It is hard to single out any particular accomplishment. I think I feel very privileged to have been able to work at the department for this long. I think when a prosecutor looks back on their career, they remember things like their first trial, they remember things like their longest trial. These tend to stick out more than stuff you do in a managerial capacity, but it would be hard for me to single out any one episode. Q. Let me just step back for a moment, just because there is certainly a lot of mention of Russian oligarchs in the news these days. Certainly, some of the individuals are part of our investigation. And with your experience, I was wondering if you could elaborate at a higher level to, if and why you think it's important for us to understand what the national security implications are of these individuals and the crimes they commit. I mean, a lot of these crimes we talk about are of a financial nature, money laundering. But I don't think it really puts maybe the full context of perhaps the import to the country. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little more in detail about, the body of work that you should have been engaged in and how you think people should really think about these cases in a larger sense, right? And why they should matter to them. Oh, Lord. Here we go. Okay, I will try to answer that question. You began with Russian oligarchs. I think one thing that outsiders do not always understand is that Russia works differently from the United States and most Western countries, that Russia is a place where, unfortunately, crime and corruption are quite pervasive, and that the line between government, business, and organized crime is thin, gray, non-existent, whatever you want to say. So what people might look at as a business deal or a government action often may be linked to criminal activity. And so we have to be very careful when we see Russian criminal, business, or government activity and be aware that they often flow into each other. It is my experience that Russian criminals, businessmen, government officials often use the government for their own private ends, and conversely, the Russian state often uses oligarchs and criminals for government ends to an extent which I think is not well understood by most people in the West. Okay, so if I'm hearing right, it sounds like in Russia it is often indistinguishable criminal networks from the official Russian government network and where those boundaries may lie. Is that accurate to say? Yes, which is exactly what he just said. Okay, and so it would be fair to say that the activities of Russian oligarchs who may be involved in crimes is especially notable because they are also heavily involved in the business of the official Russian state. Is that a fair statement? Yes. I have certainly heard many reports about particular acts of violence, both within official Russian state officials, but also these so-called Russian oligarchs. So I was wondering if you could speak more. Is that something you have witnessed in your experience as well, in the course of your prosecutions? Just certain threats that may not be as familiar to the tactics that we would expect of U.S. businessmen, certainly? Yes. Because the lines are so blurry in Russia, there is always the potential for violence. At different times since the fall of the Soviet Union, the violence has been more or less explicit, but the threat of violence is always there. And people who are doing things in Russia that involve a lot of money or government actions, I think, always are calculating whether some sort of violence could occur. Q. Has a specific threat of violence ever come up either for you personally or a colleague of yours as they have been involving themselves in investigating or prosecuting a case related with Russia? I don't believe I recall any times where I have personally felt threatened. I think investigators working in this area are always cautious. I can't remember any specific incidents as I sit here. Q. I imagine that yourself and other prosecutors, investigators who work in Russian organized crime, would have contacts with certain sources, or at least sources who are either Russian nationals or have ties to that world. Do you feel like the threat of violence affects the type of sourcing that you tend to be involved in? Sure. I think people who are reporting or conveying information about Russian organized crime and corruption, I think they are very concerned about their safety. Okay. I'm jumping ahead here, and I screwed up big time last night when I did that, so yeah, I'll be prepared to eat my words. But in what I'm hearing here, I think Shen's trying to set up a scenario where Glenn Simpson and Christopher Steele had a right to be worried about their safety in dealing directly. So if they dealt directly with the FBI, they might be in line to have violence done to them. But by using Orr as a cutout, they were removing themselves one step from the process and thereby shielding themselves from possible violence. And of course, my counter to that would be Steele was dealing directly with the FBI a lot. The FBI contacted him through Orr after they cut him loose. And he was willing to talk to them, as far as I understand it. And Glenn Simpson has been dealing with shady people for years and years and years, both as clients and as sources. So how it was that Bruce Orr suddenly made them feel all safe, warm, and cuddly, I'm really looking forward to finding out. Let's see, the prosecutors. Last sentence in the question. Do you feel like the threat of violence affects the type of sourcing that you tend to be involved in? Sure. I think people who are reporting or conveying information about Russian organized crime and corruption, I think they are very concerned about their safety. And so, in your experience, the sources related to your work, is it, in your mind, especially important to keep their identities confidential because of the potential risk to personal safety? Called it. Yes. Okay. Mr. Orr, I would like to turn back now to really just kind of lay out the chronology of your relationship with Mr. Steele and some of the contacts that you have had over the years, just so we can get a complete understanding of how that developed and where we are today. So, as I'm sure you might have gathered, one of the major reasons you have been asked to appear before this joint investigation is related to your relationship with Christopher Steele and your contacts with him. So how did you first meet Mr. Steele? I believe I met Chris Steele for the first time around 2007. That was at an official meeting. At that time, he was still employed by the British government. I went to London to talk with British government officials about Russian organized crime and what they were doing to look at the threat, and the FBI office at the U.S. Embassy in London set up a meeting. That was with Chris Steele, and there were other members of different British government agencies there, and we met and had a discussion. And afterwards, I believe the agent and I spoke with Chris Steele further over lunch. That was, I think, the first time I met him. And you said that Mr. Steele worked for the British government at the time. Was that at MI6? Yes. And you said in this meeting that he was one of several British government employees at the meeting. Yes. So, based on that introduction, is it fair to say that your contacts with Christopher Steele began as a, shared professional specialization? Yes. And that specialization would be Russian organized crime? Yes. So, at the time that you were introduced to Mr. Steele, was he considered a specialist in Russian organized crime? That was my understanding, yes. Subsequent to that first meeting, did you attend other related meetings or events with Mr. Steele? Okay, subsequent to means before, and or answers after. Here's his answer. Around the beginning of 2008, I recollect meeting Chris Steele. I believe this was the next time I met him. I'm sorry, I'm an idiot. I got subsequent and prior mixed up. I don't know why I did that. I'm sorry. Let me start over without my idiocy. Question. Subsequent to that first meeting, did you attend other related meetings or events with Mr. Steele? A. Around the beginning of 2008, I recollect meeting Chris Steele. I believe this was the next time I met him at some sort of conference in England. I forget the exact location, but it was talking about Russian organized crime, and there were many participants there. I don't remember exactly, and Chris Steele was one of the people there. How did you run into him? Was he a panelist? Did you see him? Recognize him? How did that? I think it was the latter, but I don't recall exactly. Okay, so at the time that you met Mr. Steele again, it was in the capacity as a previous or professional contact or acquaintance. Is that correct? That is right. Okay. Is it generally common to encounter either current or former law enforcement intelligence officials at such conferences? Yes. Okay. Rough estimate. How often would you say you encountered, such individuals like a second time at an event like that? It is pretty common. I can't give a percentage. But you wouldn't be surprised at all to see a familiar face from your professional network at a conference like that. Exactly. Okay. Can you sort of describe in general terms the community of law enforcement and intelligence officials who do specialize in Russian organized crime? Would you call it an extremely large number of people or limited? I'm just trying to get a sense of the world and sort of how tight-knit it is versus who how tight-knit it is versus who is likely to know each other where. I couldn't give you an exact number, obviously, but I know the number of agents and prosecutors working on, say, Russian organized crime matters has historically been pretty small. That goes both for the United States and for other nations as well. So, over the years, you tend to meet most of the people who are working in this area. Okay, so of the specialists who work in Russian organized crime, there are very few specialists that you wouldn't know, given the number of years you have been working in this area. Is that fair to say? I probably know most of them, yes. Okay, and most of these other individuals probably also know each other and likely have professional contacts with each other over the years, yes. Okay, so let's just jump ahead a little bit here, Ms. Shen. If these are people who are in a small, tight-knit community and pretty much for the most part know each other, except in rare circumstances, how is it that Christopher Steele didn't have enough of a working relationship with Peter Strzok that he couldn't have contacted him directly? After all, Peter Strzok was head of counterintelligence at the FBI, and he was most significantly at work on the Russia desk. His testimony yesterday showed over and over again how insanely, I'm sorry, that's not the right word, how incredibly sensitive he was to the any machinations the Russian government might have in dealings with any United States functions, government functions. So, answer that. As it is here, I think she's trying to set it up to where it makes perfect sense that Christopher Steele would reach out to Bruce Orr and say, hey, I'm working at Fusion GPS, the same as your wife, and I need you to go to the FBI and give them information for me. Explain how one of those is different than the other. Pretty easy, isn't it? Q. So I guess it would be fair to say that your association with Mr. Steele developed naturally because, again, there are just only so many experts in Russian organized crime. Is that correct? Yes. And so you did not develop a relationship with Mr. Steele for any improper or political purpose. That is correct. Yes, kitty cat, you're beautiful. Would you describe your relationship with Mr. Steele as a purely professional one? Over the years, we would talk and have lunch together. So I would say, we would talk a little bit about our families. So in that sense, it is professional, but it is a cordial relationship. Sure. So you would talk about your families in a way that, say, work colleagues might talk about their families. Yes. So since meeting Mr. Steele in sort of the two specific meetings we just talked about, how often would you estimate you had contacts with him subsequently? It is hard to say, maybe once a year. It might be a couple of years between hearing from him, or I might hear from him twice in 1 year, but not that frequently. What form did these contacts tend to take What form did these contacts tend to take place? Were they in person, calls, emails? Some of both. At some point, Chris Steele left the British government and became involved with a firm called Orbis. And at that point, I know sometime after that, we were in contact, and we stayed in contact. So sometimes it was by telephone, email. And generally speaking, what were the purposes of your contacts with Mr. Steele? Generally, Mr. Steele would be providing some information about Russian organized crime that he thought would be of interest to the U.S. government. Oh boy. And so these contacts with Mr. Steele tended to be related to your work in Russian organized crime. Yes. And throughout your contacts with him, did you consider Mr. Steele to be a trustworthy expert in his field? Yes. He was certainly very skilled, and yes, I believe he was pretty trustworthy. Did Mr. Steele ever have involvement in or make contributions to any of your prosecutions at the Department of Justice? Chris Steele provided information that did help specific cases. Yes. And did you sometime also consult with him on your official matters, or was it more just receiving information? I think it was more receiving information. And this information that you received from Mr. Steele proved credible and actionable in some of your cases. At least in some of the cases, I think it was actionable, yes. Okay. Some of the cases, at least in some of the cases, I think. weasel word, weasel word, weasel word, showing that Christopher Steele was not 100% accurate. So you could be disinclined to accept some of his information at face value, especially if you knew it was opposition research and that he had a hard-on against Trump. And I guess Ms. Shen doesn't see it that way. Shen continues. Okay, so now I would like to sort of switch to the 2016-2017 timeframe. And since we are in unclassified setting, I will try to keep all the information to that, but if at any point you think the answer does involve classified information, please just let us know and we can address that. Do you recall what your first contact with Mr. Steele? Do you recall what your first contact was with Mr. Steele in 2016? I believe we had some sort of email contact early in 2016. What did that contact consist of? He was providing some information about Oleg Deripaska. And again, we heard his name in the last round, but can you just briefly describe to us, like, who is Oleg Deripaska? Like, what is his significance? Oleg Deripaska is a Russian oligarch. He, until very recently, was the head of a company called Rusal, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, aluminum producers in the world. He also has connections to organized crime and to the Russian government. And why did Mr. Steele reach out to you about Oleg Deripaska? I believe he was letting me know that Mr. Deripaska would be in the United States at some point. And why did you believe he thought that would be information significant to you? I don't recall. I mean, I don't know exactly what he was thinking. He was just letting me know in case we wanted to do something, I suppose. So it was a fairly random bit of information that even Orr couldn't quite place as to what the significance of it was. What was your reaction to that, to receiving that information? I thanked him for the information. Did you respond to him in any way at the time? I think my response was basically, thank you, I'll keep an eye on it, or something like that. So it was just a piece of information that he thought you might be interested in, but it wasn't part of an existing conversation, or it wasn't part of some larger conversation at the time. We had spoken about Deripaska over the years, so it is just the latest bit of information. Okay. Do you recall what your next contact was with Mr. Steele after that regarding Deripaska? Not specifically. I know there were a couple of contacts early in the year, but then I don't remember exactly what the next contact was. Do you recall if Mr. Steele brought issues to you other than regarding Mr. Deripaska in early 2016 timeframe or later that year? As I sit here, I don't recall if there were any other topics. Ms. Shen. So I'm going to introduce as Exhibit 1 a July 1st, 2016 email from yourself to Chris Steele with the subject matter, availability for a Skype comm with CDS. Mr. Orr, are you familiar with this email chain? Yes. Okay. I will also note that this email is Bates stamped, gives a long serial number, indicating that it was produced to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and marked law enforcement sensitive in the header. This document was, however, recently leaked to the press and posted online. So, in the first message at the bottom of the page, Mr. Steele writes to you, quote, Dear Bruce, I hope all is well with you. I am seeing, redacted, in London next week to discuss ongoing business, but there is something separate I want to discuss informally and separately. It concerns our favorite business tycoon. So, Mr. Orr, I think you already answered this question, but can you describe what Mr. Steele wanted to discuss with you informally and separately about your favorite business tycoon? I don't recall if this is the specific time he raised it, but I think he was letting me know that there might be an opportunity to interview Oleg Deripaska. So again, our favorite business tycoon is a reference to Oleg Deripaska. Yes. And the favorite business tycoon is not a reference to then-candidate Donald Trump. No. Can you speak a little bit more to why during this time frame Mr. Steele would reach out to you, again involving Mr. Deripaska? Again, I'm not 100% sure just from looking at this document, but I believe that about this time Chris Steele was letting me know that there might be an opportunity for the U.S. government to interview Oleg Deripaska. Shen. So I am now going to introduce as Exhibit 2 an email chain noted July 30, 2016, between yourself and Chris Steele with the subject CDS in DC. It is also bait stamped with gobbledygook and marked law enforcement sensitive in the header. This document was also leaked to the press and posted publicly recently. Are you familiar with this? Mr. Orr, are you familiar with this email chain? Yes. So, at the top of the chain, Mr. Steele writes, quote, "Great to see you and Nellie this morning, Bruce. Let's keep in touch on the substantive issues. Glenn is happy to speak to you on this if it would help." End quote. Mr. Orr, who were all the attendees of this morning meeting referred to in the chain? Chris Steele was there. He had an associate at the meeting whose name I do not recall, and my wife Nellie and I. Okay, and what were the substantive issues that were raised during this meeting? Chris Steele provided some information to us. Specifically, these are the things I mentioned before. He talked about the people that Carter Page had met with when he was in Moscow sometime before this. He told me that he had information that the former head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service had said that they had Trump over a barrel. And he told me that Paul Hauser, a lawyer who worked for Oleg Deripaska, was collecting information about a large amount of money that Oleg Deripaska had, or that Paul Manafort had stolen from Oleg Deripaska. So I believe in the last round you said that some of those Carter Page meetings were with high-level Russian officials. Is that accurate? Yes. And none of those were illegal, chickie. None of them. And did you recall any of the names of the high-level Russian officials? Any. The trouble is that there are several high-level Russian officials with similar names, so I do not want to get the wrong name here. Okay. Was it notable to you that Carter Page had in-person meetings with high-level Russian officials? Yes. Why? Carter Page had been dealing with the Russians for years. Start over again. Or, yes. In combination with the other item that Chris Steele mentioned, it was very concerning. Yes. Okay. So it is not typical to hear about a U.S. citizen who has meetings with high-level Russian officials. Bullshit. Is that fair to say? Yes, but in particular in this case, I think there had been a press story where Carter Page or some associate claimed he had met with different people. So it was particularly concerning here because it sounded like he may be concealing that he had met with higher-level Russian officials. I see. So Mr. Steele was bringing you information not just about what he believed were meetings that took place, but meetings that were attempted to be concealed. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, so in that same email, the Glenn, is that a reference to Mr. Glenn Simpson? Yes. And why do you think Mr. Steele suggested that you might want to talk to Glenn about these issues? Mr. Simpson. Well, I don't know exactly what Chris Steele was thinking, of course, but I knew that Chris Steele was working for Glenn Simpson and that Glenn might have additional information that Chris either didn't have or was not authorized to give me, or whatever. I think that should be authorized to present instead of prevent. Did you, in fact, talk to Mr. Simpson about these issues? I believe I spoke with Mr. Simpson a few weeks later in August. And did Mr. Simpson provide you additional details about... He did provide me some additional information. What were some of those additional details? Again, I don't want to... I met with him a couple of times, and I met with Chris Steele a couple of times, so I don't want to get it wrong. I don't know exactly what Glenn Simpson provided in August. Were there any other topics that were discussed during your July 30th, 2016 meeting? Yes, there were. Based on my sketchy notes from the time, I think there was some information relating to the Russia doping scandal, but I don't recall the substance of that. And based on my notes, it indicated that Chris Steele had provided some reports to the FBI, I think too, but that Glenn Simpson had more. Why was Glenn Simpson providing more information about Russian activity than Chris Steele was? Curious. That's me asking. Q. Was this the Russian doping scandal related to the FIFA allegations? I don't recall. Okay. So your wife, Nellie, also attended this meeting. What, if any, role did she participate in the substantive decisions? I have to back up for a second. Russian doping related to FIFA? I remember there being doping related to the upcoming Olympics. I believe in Sochi. But or was it? Was it the ones in Japan? Either way, and I don't even know FIFA tests for doping. Interesting. Was this the Russian doping scandal related to the FIFA allegations? I don't recall. Okay. So your wife Nellie also attended this meeting. What, if any, role did she participate in these substantive discussions? I don't think she said anything, and I don't know if she was present for all of the discussion, because Chris Steele and I, at least for part of the discussion, were standing away from the table. But she was there, and she certainly heard some of it. Okay. And did any topic of this meeting relate to your ongoing substantive work at the Department of Justice? Yes. It was relating to Russian organized crime and Russian government actions. To me, it seemed like, yes, it was part of the same topics I had been pursuing for many years. During this meeting, did you also talk about the Trump campaign and the fall election? Yes. The Carter Page information, I think, was significant because there was some sort of connection, at least in the press, I think, between Carter Page and the Trump campaign. And, of course, the second item had to do with, supposedly, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service having some kind of compromising information about Donald Trump. Remind me, I think the term you had used was, had Trump over a barrel. Is that accurate? That's what my notes indicate. I think that is what Chris said. Okay, and how do you interpret having Trump over a barrel to mean? Okay, thank you, my executive producer. 2014 FIFA scandal, entire Russia World Cup team investigated. So that was the World Cup that was held in Russia. Oh no, that was the last. Wait, was the last World Cup in Russia, or was it in Brazil, or was it Argentina? No, that was in Argentina. I'm so confused now. Anyway, I thank you for correcting me on that. I did not know FIFA tested for doping. Interesting. Thank you again. Backing up, Shen. Okay, and how did you interpret having Trump over a barrel to mean? My interpretation is that it meant that, if true, the Russian government had some kind of compromising material on Donald Trump. Okay, so in reporting this to you, do you believe Mr. Steele believed it to be true that the Russian government had some sort of compromising material on then-candidate Donald Trump? I think my impression is that Chris Steele believed his sources. What I should say, in addition, though, is that whenever you are dealing with information from Russia, you have to be careful because it is a very complicated place. And so even information from a good source has to be looked at carefully. So all that foundation you laid earlier, Shen, about Chris Steele being a worthy and trustworthy source just goes to show that Bruce Orr knew better than to take him completely at his word, that there had to be more, as Reagan said in his meeting with Gorbachev, there's the old Soviet saying, trust, then verify. So that's what we've got going on here, dear. And the FBI did not verify, they just trusted. Okay. In the last round, I think someone noted that shortly after this July 30 meeting, the FBI's investigation into potential coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia was initiated by the FBI, although you weren't aware of that at the time. Is that correct? That is right. Okay. So just to be clear, your July 30, 2016 meeting didn't have anything to do with the decision to initiate the investigation into links between Russia and the Trump campaign. None that I know of. Okay. So, moving back to, I guess, August 2016, do you recall if Mr. Steele maintained contact with you into the summer and the fall of 2016? Back from a break at 11:12 a.m. Mr. Orr, yes, but I don't know. The next time I'm aware of meeting with Chris Steele is in September, so yes. Ms. Shen continues. And what took place at that September meeting with Chris Steele? Chris Steele was in Washington, D.C. again, and he reached out to me, and again we met for breakfast and he provided some additional information. And can you describe what that additional information was he provided? Again, I would have to look at my notes because I don't want to mix up the different meetings. Okay. Is it fair to say it was a follow-on conversation from the July 30, 2016? Was it similar topics? Yes. Okay. Did you have any other meetings in 2016 after that September 2016 meeting with Christopher Steele? I don't believe so. Okay. Did you continue to speak or exchange communications with Chris Steele after that? Yes. September 2016 meeting? Sorry, yes. And were those communications on the same set of topics that were brought up previously in the July 30, 2016 meeting? Yes. Okay. Were there any communications you had with Chris Steele in the rest of 2016 that were separate topics entirely unrelated to what was discussed previously? At some point, Chris Steele provided me with some information about an unrelated matter. I don't recall if it was 2016 or 2017. But would it be accurate to say that the rest of your contacts, communications with Mr. Steele in 2016, once again related to the substantive information he provided during that July 30, 2016 meeting? Yes, we were following along on. He was providing more information along the same lines. Notice how she's not saying specifically what they were talking about, that he was, giving information regarding the Trump campaign collusion with Russia, supposed collusion. She's not touching on that. She's just basically nibbling around the edges of, well, this is what you talked about before, right? And this was something else that was that had been brought up previously, right? She may get to it, but this is driving me a little crazy. Q. So, some of these communications, did they relate to the Russian government's intent to interfere with the 2016 presidential election? That's how I read it. Yes. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay. And did Mr. Steele provide you with specific information related to the Russian government's attempt to interfere with the presidential election? I believe so. Yes. I believe so. He did or he didn't. And I think I know the answer to this, but so a number of Mr. Steele's communications were related to members of the Trump campaign and allegations of colluding with Russia. Is that correct? I believe so, yes. The information that Mr. Steele relayed to you in 2016, did you share this information with federal law enforcement officials? Yes, I did. Okay, and who exactly did you share the information with? As I mentioned earlier, my first move was to reach out for Andrew McCarthy. Or Andrew McCabe is what you meant? McCabe, yes, not McCarthy, I'm sorry. Andrew McCarthy will be angry. I know him too. But Andy McCabe, yes, and met with him and Lisa Page and provided information to him. I subsequently met with Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, and eventually Joe Pientka at the FBI. And I also provided this information to people in the criminal division, specifically Bruce Schwartz, Zanib Ahmad, and Andrew Weissman. Okay, so I believe you described a meeting you attended with Lisa Page and Peter Strzok and officials in the criminal division. Is that correct? Yes. And I believe you said earlier that you did not know Peter Strzok prior to that meeting. Is that correct? I believe that is correct. Did you know Lisa Page prior to that meeting? Yes. Okay, how did you know Lisa Page? Lisa Page had previously been a trial attorney in the organized crime and racketeering section, so she was one of my employees. Oh, okay. The other criminal division officials at that meeting, did you know them prior to that meeting? Yes. I worked with Mr. Schwartz for many years, and I had worked with Ms. Ahmad for a lesser period of time when she was on detail to Washington. And I don't recall for sure whether Andrew Weissman was present at this particular meeting, but I've known him for some years as well. And again, what exactly was the purpose of that meeting? Was that for you to relay specific information to those individuals? That was part of the purpose for the meeting. I think the criminal division officials also wanted to make sure that the criminal and national security parts of the FBI were talking or communicating. So in other words, there was a desire to have the people with the right portfolios in the room on the same page to have that same information. I believe that's yes. What was your understanding of why Lisa Page was part of that meeting? Was it as someone representing Mr. McCabe and reporting back to him, or was it a different capacity? Well, She had been introduced into this with my first meeting with Andrew McCabe. So yes, in that sense. But I don't know what she was reporting or exactly what her responsibilities were as part of the subsequent meeting. Sure, I'll just ask it more generally. What was your understanding of why Lisa Page was participating in that meeting? I think she was working on the investigation. Okay, and what was your understanding of why Peter Strzok specifically was in that meeting? I believe he was working on the investigation as well. Again, a Q. Again, I mean, this was discussed last round. Obviously, these two names have been in the news for lots of different reasons. I guess I just want to be able to dispel any notion that there's anything more, perhaps, than two officials performing their jobs at the time. So trying to form the question, do you have any reason to believe that Lisa Page and Peter Strzok's attendance at this meeting should indicate any nefarious purpose or concern or implication of bias on the Russia investigation or law enforcement community at large? I don't know that anyone posited that Strzok and Page meeting with Orr was necessarily part of their bias. It could go towards that. Now, I haven't read a lot of this recently again, so when the Bruce Orr testimony came out, I was pretty sick, and I didn't hear a lot of it. So maybe I'm missing the point here. But it is fairly easy to just state flat out that Strzok and Page were there because that was their job. They were on the investigation, and they needed to hear this information. I think the question that I would be asking is, why are they talking to Bruce Orr? Not whether or not they're biased, although that still is a concern. But what are they doing talking to someone who has nothing to do with this investigation and is in fact being a conduit for source material from a former British spy working for the DNC and Hillary Clinton? Again, that's just the way I look at it. These two names. I believe he was working on the investigation as well. Q. Again, I mean, this was discussed last round. Obviously, these two names have been in the news for lots of different reasons. I guess I just want to be able to dispel any notion that there's anything more, perhaps, than two officials performing their jobs at the time. So, trying to form the question, do you have any reason to believe that Lisa Page and Peter Strzok's attendance at this meeting should indicate any nefarious purpose or concern or implication of bias on the Russia investigation or law enforcement community at large? The answer is no. I saw their participation as appropriate since I had originally conveyed my information to Mr. McCabe, and he in turn had put Lisa Page and then Peter Strzok in contact with me, so it seemed like the natural progression. And in addition, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page said they would put me in contact with a line-level FBI agent who would be my contact, and so that seemed appropriate. Your being there wasn't appropriate. Q. Okay, so subsequent to that meeting, Lisa Page and Peter Strzok were not your main points of contacts at the FBI. Is that correct? That's correct. So at the time, you decided to share the information you received from Mr. Steele with federal law enforcement. Were you directed to share this information by someone, or was this a proactive decision on your part? It was my decision. And why did you think it was important to share this information with the FBI? No, that's not the question. The question is not why did he think it was important. The question is, why did he think it was his job? That's what you should be asking, Ms. Shen. To repeat the question, why did you think it was important to share this information with the FBI? Answer. I was very concerned when I got the information. It seemed to have very serious national security implications. I wanted to get it to the officials, the career officials, who would be able to take the information and evaluate it and decide whether further action was appropriate. Okay? And I think you mentioned earlier that this is something you had done before, which is to pass on fact information to the FBI. Is that correct? That's correct. And in the past, did you do so for similar reasons? Because you had a national security concern or something of that nature? Whenever I received information that had an organized crime or national security nexus, I would convey that information to the FBI. Okay, so even if an issue wasn't part of your current official duties, you thought it was an appropriate practice or a desired practice, perhaps, to pass information to the FBI. Is that correct? Anytime a citizen gets information about a crime or a national security threat, it's appropriate to convey it to the FBI. Okay, thank you. And again, totally missing the point. He's inserting himself into an investigation. It wasn't a matter of, in his previous duties, he was picking up information that needed to be passed on through his job. It wasn't his job to get information from Christopher Steele and Glenn Simpson and then go to the FBI with it. Completely separate matters. Yes, quote-unquote unwitting pawn. Yes. Let's see. Unwitting or unwilling. Right. Thank you, Picasso knows. Continuing with Ms. Shen. Okay, I'd like to introduce as Exhibit 3 a letter dated July 6, 2018 from Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Chuck Grassley to Deputy Director Rosenstein and FBI Director Wray that in its first paragraph is, quote, formally requesting the declassification of the FD-302 interview summaries in which Bruce Orr relayed his contacts with Christopher Steele and to request that you produce the declassified versions directly to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Mr. Orr, are you familiar at all with this letter? No. Okay, I'll give you some time to review it if you like. Okay. Very good, Jason. Very good. Shen. Okay. So on page 2 of the letter, it lists 12 separate dates in 302s where the FBI interviewed you, indicating the first interview took place on November 22nd, 2016, and the last one on May 15, 2017. Is this list of interviews and dates generally consistent with your recollection? Yes. Discussion off the record. Okay, before they come back from that discussion, how come his 302s don't start until November 22nd of 2016 when he was going to McCabe and Strzok and Page as at least by August of 2016? Did it take them another 4 months to put him in contact with a line agent, and that's when his review his 302 started? Doesn't seem very plausible to me. They come back from their discussion off the record. Or, right, I can't recall specific dates. Ms. Shen continues, but nothing strikes you as being inaccurate looking at it. I mean, understanding that you're not going to be able to actually remember each date for the interview, but this is a rough time frame that you recall being interviewed in? Yes. The caveat, I would say, is I continued to have some conversations with Christopher Steele after May 15, 2017. I've reported all of those to the FBI, but I do not see any 302s relating to those conversations. Okay, generally, how soon after communications with Mr. Steele would you notify the FBI? As quickly as possible, same day or next day, whenever possible. Okay, and after you notified the FBI, how soon after that would the FBI be able to interview you about those communications? Usually within a day. Did you provide any documents or evidence to the FBI as part of these interviews? We mentioned 2 memory sticks, so I provided those to the FBI. Okay, did you provide any other documents or evidence other than 2 memory sticks? On a couple of occasions, I had written up my notes, and I don't recall whether I gave them copies or showed them, but I may have given them copies. Okay, and these notes, were they contemporaneous with your meetings or calls with Mr. Steele? I generally didn't write note. Well, yes. But when I met with Chris Steele or Glenn Simpson, I did not take notes during the meeting, so I would have written them sometime. I would have written something after. Okay, all right, thank you. And I think we're out of time for this round, so we'll take a short break. Thank you. There's a recess. Okay, come back on the record with Mr. Parmenter. Mr. Meadows. Mr. Meadows speaks. Mr. Orr, thank you for your testimony. I guess I'm going to try to ask some clarifying questions because my good friend Mr. Gowdy is a prosecutor and an attorney, and I guess some of this stuff I'm just scratching my head to figure out why it would have happened this way. So, for the record, you said Sally Yates did not know, to your knowledge, that you were involved in coordinating with the FBI. Mr. Orr, that's right, to my knowledge. Meadows, are there other types of investigations that you've been involved with where you didn't inform those that you reported to? When I was working on cases, of course, I would inform my superiors on the cases. Right. But she was your superior, so why would you not informed her of your working, it seemed like, multiple times on this particular investigative matter with the FBI? Well, I wasn't serving as an investigator or prosecutor on that case. I was simply getting source lead information. So did you get any of that information? Were you paid on official DOJ time while you got that information? Yes, I think it's overall part of my job, but it wasn't a case, so, Meadows. So you're saying it was part of your job to do it, but it was not part of your job to inform your superiors? Or, I thought the information, Meadows, because I have a hard time with that. I think most of the American people would have a hard time. Why would Bruce Orr independently engage 60-plus times with Christopher Steele through text messages or phone calls or personal meetings and not inform anybody at DOJ? Or, well, first of all, I did inform some people at DOJ, so who did you inform? In the criminal division. But Meadows, so who did you inform? Who did you inform at DOJ? Or, the people I mentioned, some people in the criminal division, Bruce Schwartz, Zainab Ahmad, Andrew Weissman. So why would you have informed Bruce Schwartz and not Sally Yates? At the time my lead was this is source information, lead information. It's nothing that they can do anything with. It should be passed to the FBI for them to use it or not as they feel appropriate. And it was obviously, scary, inflammatory, however you want to characterize it, and I did not. I wanted to keep it in the career channels where agents could do whatever was appropriate with it and not make it part of a larger policy discussion. Meadows. Well, so how do you reconcile that, wanting to keep it in the proper channels, that you use this improper or unconventional channel to actually get this information to the FBI? Why would you be so concerned about protocol in one area and yet do something that, according to your previous testimony, you've never done since you were employed at DOJ since 1991? You've never acted in this way before. Why would you have been so concerned about protocol in one area and not protocol in the other area? Or, well, I think as I said before, I have received information from different people about organized crime over the years, and in each case I've provided it to the FBI. Frankly, I don't think most of that goes to the level where my superiors, would have had any use for that information or had any, anything they could do with the information. That's not the point. They're having anything be able to do with the information is not the point. It's why didn't you tell them that you were acting as a conduit on company time some of the time? Or continues. So this wasn't the first time I had spoken directly to the FBI. That was a regular practice of mine to let the FBI know whatever I heard. This is going to get interesting. Meadows, was it a regular practice in those previous examples that you're thinking of to let the people that you reported to know that you had received information? It's hard to characterize generally, but, Meadows, well, you were remembering other instances that you were just sharing. So is it your typical habit to let your supervisor or those you report to know your professional activity? In general, yes. And so in this particular case, you believe because the information was that salacious or inflammatory, I guess, is what you were saying, and not necessarily, I guess, could not be used, I guess is your word. Is that correct? Could not be used? Is that what you just said? I don't recall exactly what I just said, but I think maybe I misspoke. What I said is that I didn't think my superiors in the Deputy Attorney General's office would be able to act on that information because they're not, but you could. I could pass it to the FBI. You could act on it, but they couldn't. I could pass it to the FBI. All they could do is pass it to the FBI. All right, so let me go a little bit further. So obviously this relationship that you had with the FBI matured as it got closer to the 2016 election and beyond. There were more contacts, wouldn't you? There were more contacts. So earlier in your testimony, So, early in your testimony, you talked about the fact that you had a personal relationship with Glenn Simpson that dated back, I think, several years, is what you said. I wouldn't necessarily call it personal, but yes, I had met him several times over the years. All right. And so at what point did you reach out to Mr. Simpson as it relates to your wife's contract with work? As it relates to your wife's contract work. Or, I don't believe I ever reached out to Glenn Simpson about my wife's work. So how did she get a contract with Glenn Simpson? I don't know. I know there was some sort of contact, but it wasn't by me. So you know about all of her helping write the dossier and give you this information, but you don't know how she got a contract. You mean a husband and a wife, she's getting paid. How much did she get paid? I don't remember exactly. Approximately? I don't even know. Any guess I would make would be wrong. Must be nice to be making so much money that you don't have to know how much your wife is making too. I guess they just turn their taxes over to some ADD kid who worked out of the back of a trailer and paid him a few dollars and then signed the forms and walked away. I'm sure that's what it is. Meadows, approximately, or I don't even know. Any guess I make would be wrong. So you can recall with specificity some of this other stuff, but you can't recall how much your wife got paid and how she got the job. Well, my wife was a Russia. Meadows, I find that curious as a prosecutor how you would not remember those things. Or, my wife is a Russia analyst. She worked in the field for several years as well. I didn't ask about her credentials. Or, right, how did she get a contract job with Glenn Simpson? I don't remember who made the contact, whether she spoke with Glenn Simpson directly or whether there was another party or someone else involved. I just know it wasn't me. So when she came home and said, honey, I got a job with Glenn Simpson, what did you say? Oh, I'm sure we had a conversation at the time. I just can't remember now. Did you say there may be a conflict of interest if Glenn Simpson is being paid by the DNC or Hillary Clinton and I'm working for the Department of Justice? Could there potentially be a conflict? Did you say anything like that? And that's something, I don't know if it's going to come up in this or not, but it was shown that Bruce Orr hid on his financial disclosure forms with the DOJ that his wife was working for Fusion GPS, that she had done work for the DNC and Hillary Clinton, how much she was getting paid. He did not put any of that in his form. I think that's one of the reasons he got demoted right away. Well, my wife started working for Glenn Simpson doing a contractor for Fusion GPS in late 2015, and I don't believe it had anything to do with the campaign at that point. So she never talked about the campaign with you. Well, at some point, I became aware that the topics she was researching had to do with the possible Meadows. When did you become aware? Or, I don't recall exactly. So when you became aware, what was your conversation? Did you tell her that it created a problem for you because you were with the Department of Justice? I think she can work for the firm that has dealings with the DNC. I don't think that's Meadows, and you can investigate it. While she's working for the firm that is hired by the DNC, and you can be the source that leads information from the same group to the FBI. Do you not see a problem with that, Mr. Orr? Or, would you do it the same way if you had to do it over again, Mr. Orr? That's hard to say. I was not part of the investigation. I did not have any kind of investigative, but you were part of the investigation. You coordinated with the FBI. You're part of the investigation. As I saw it, Meadows, multiple times, according to your own testimony. Thank you, Jason, for your compliment. You're very welcome. I'm glad you're getting some enjoyment out of it. That means a lot. Thank you. I'll try not to burst the buttons on your shirt if you laugh too much. Do not send me a bill for the tailor. Do not. Meadows, multiple times, according to your own testimony. Or, as I saw it, I was receiving information that I passed to people who were working on the investigation, and they decided what to do with it. I don't know what they did with it. I don't know whether I don't know what investigations specifically were existing at the time. I didn't have any input or work on those investigations. I'm just providing information. Meadows, well, hold on. I want to give you a chance to correct. You had no input into the investigation. Is that your sworn testimony here today? Or, I don't believe I did. I was providing information that I knew to Meadows. So you gave no commentary on the validity of what the source told you or what you thought. You gave no commentary? Or, your 302s don't suggest that. Or, no, I warned them that my wife worked for Fusion GPS. When did you do that? When I first spoke with Mr. McCabe. In August of 2016? Yes, So in August of 2016, you tell Andy McCabe that you're concerned because your wife works for Fusion GPS, and that's where you're getting the information. Yes, I wanted Mr. McCabe to know that there was a possible, that the Meadows conflict of interest or appearance thereof, yeah. So there's a possible conflict of interest in August of 2016 before a FISA warrant is actually initiated. Well, first of all, Meadows, is that correct? Or no, because I think I did not mean to say conflict of interest. What I would say is that in evaluating any information that I transmitted to the FBI, I wanted the FBI to be aware of any possible bias. Meadows, so you believe there was the possibility of bias, or yes. Meadows, okay, so there's a possibility of bias, and that would affect the credibility of this confidential human source or the information you got from them. Yes. All right. So in your conversations, and so I assume that you had a conversation with Glenn Simpson sometime between July 30, when you met with Christopher Steele, and this August meeting, we must have reached out somehow to arrange the August meeting, but I don't think there was any substantive conversation. So text messages, maybe a phone call here or there to try to arrange it. Something to arrange the meeting, yes. All right. So you're the coordinating person to bring an opposition research group together with the FBI. Why did it take Bruce Orr? Why did it not take, why was it not Peter Strzok? Why was it not someone else? Why would it take someone with the Department of Justice to do that? Well, I know. I don't know why Peter Strzok or someone else. Meadows, could it be because your wife worked with Fusion GPS? Or no. Oh, you're saying that had nothing to do with it? No, I know Glenn Simpson separately. And Chris Steele had mentioned in July, I believe, that Glenn Simpson might be willing to talk to me. So yes. Okay, he says no. Then he says no, and then he says yes. Okay. Meadows. So why was Christopher Steele so interested in the 2016 presidential election? From what I read, he's from England. Why would he be so concerned and so against Donald Trump, the candidate, that he would want you to talk to Glenn Simpson? Chris Steele has, for a long time, been very concerned about Russian crime and corruption and what he sees as Russian malign acts around the world, in the U.S., UK, and elsewhere. And if he had information that he believed showed that the Russian government was acting in a hostile way to the United States, he wanted to get that information to me. So if he's real concerned about Russian intervention, why would you and Mr. Steele be talking about trying to make sure that Mr. Deripaska could get into the United States when the State Department didn't want him here? But you and Mr. Steele wanted to make sure that Mr. Deripaska got here. If he was concerned about Russian interference, why would you be doing that? Or, first of all, I did not want Mr. Deripaska to come to the United States. Well, the emails exchanged suggest something very different. I respectfully disagree. I know Chris Steele, so why would Chris Steele then? I think Chris Steele, what did he convey to you? He conveyed, I believe, if I remember correctly, that there might be an opportunity to interview Mr. Deripaska. About what? About Russia? All kinds of things. Trump? Yes. I don't know about Trump, but certainly about Russia. Well, you had multiple conversations about your favorite business tycoon, which you say was Deripaska. It could have been Mr. Trump, but let's assume that you're correct in your assumption since you didn't really know. Is that correct? He didn't say, I'm talking about my favorite business tycoon, Deripaska. No, but we had conversations over the years about Mr. Deripaska. I'm getting tired of that name. Well, not a whole lot, because I went back to look at the number of conversations. Your interactions with Mr. Steele on Mr. Deripaska had been limited prior to 2015. Isn't that correct? But it's been, no, for the record, is that correct? It is correct. But it's been brought up every time pretty much when he talked with me. So on the 3 times that you talked to him prior to 2015 about Deripaska, he brought it up each time? Pretty much, yeah. All right. So the 3 things he brings up. So every time he brings up Deripaska, in what context did he bring up Deripaska as it relates to Mr. Trump with you? Usually he was telling me that whether Deripaska had received some kind of official visa, which could not be blocked by the State Department, and he would be coming to the United States. Is it your understanding? I have credible evidence that would suggest that your understanding is the FBI actually helped Mr. Deripaska figure out how to get here officially? Are you aware of any of these conversations where he would come as a business delegation with the UN? Well, Mr. Weinsheimer, can we have a second? Discussion off the record. Mr. Orr, so I'm aware that the FBI spoke with Mr. Deripaska on other occasions, but I don't know the specific topics they discussed. All right. Are you aware that the FBI spoke to Mr. Deripaska in September of 2016? I don't recall specifically for 2016. Are you aware that based on some of your conversations? Go ahead. Or, my apologies, 2016, I was not aware of that. Meadows, all right. So you're not aware that there were any FBI involvement with Mr. Deripaska in September 2016. I don't. That's news to me. All right. So let me go on a little bit further, because I guess I want to go back to where Mr. Gowdy was talking about in this December 20 conversation, or text message, where it says, Bruce has more information for us. Actually, I think the redacted name under there is Joe, for Joe Pientka. So was Joe Pientka your go-between in December when you got additional information from either Christopher Steele or Glenn Simpson and getting it to the FBI? Or, Joe Pientka, I believe, was my contact at that time. Yeah. So he was your contact at that time. Yes. You have a meeting. You get information. You immediately go to Joe Pientka, who immediately goes to Peter Strzok. Are you aware of that? No. All right. Where did you assume that Joe Pientka would go with the information that you gave him? I didn't know. Still to this day, you do not know? Well, now from what you're telling me, it sounds like no, not based on me, based on other things. You are unaware that there was a coordination between Joe Pientka and Peter Strzok or Lisa Page. Meadows, you're unaware of that. Or, I was not aware of the specific roles that they were playing. Okay. Specifically, did Joe Pientka ever say that he was giving it to the people that he reported to, that he would take your information and get it to someone else? No. I think they just say thank you for the information, and then it disappears into the FBI. That's kind of an image, of this huge maw with teeth, shaggy, jagged teeth all around the edges. And inside is written in, ghostly ink, FBI. You can see information just kind of flowing into it and never to be seen again. Meadows. So if it just disappears in the FBI, you're not sure where it's going. Why did you continue to be so aggressive after November 1 or thereabouts when Christopher Steele had been terminated by the FBI in and around that particular time? Why would you have continued on your conversations and intelligence gathering with Christopher Steele knowing that he had been terminated by the FBI and you were just getting information from that same source back to the FBI? Or, when I got a call from Chris Steele and he provided information, if it seemed like it was significant, I would provide it to the FBI. But he had been terminated by the FBI, and your previous testimony said you were aware of that. At some point, I became aware he had been terminated, but nevertheless, when I receive information from Chris Steele, I'm not going to sit on it. I've got to give it to the FBI. So why didn't you say, listen, Chris, you've been terminated. I'm at the Department of Justice. Why don't you take this back to the FBI? Why was that not happening? Was there an unofficial coordination that the FBI terminated, and now they're recognizing you're this backdoor conduit to get them the information? I don't know what they were thinking. I didn't ask you what they were thinking. What I'm asking you, was there an unofficial back channel that was acknowledged by the FBI that they knew that that they knew that you were the unofficial handler for Chris Steele after that termination. I don't know if you can characterize it that way. All I can say is I would get calls from Chris Steele and I would pass it to the FBI. Now, Meadows missed this, or he doesn't care, but something that Orr said earlier, he said, if I felt it was important, or words to that effect, I would pass it along. So not only was he being a conduit, he was being a filter, according to his own words. I think that makes him even more complicit in what's going on. Meadows. All right, so let me ask you a different question then. Did the FBI ever encourage you to reach out to try to get additional information from Chris Steele? Yes, there was one occasion. All right, so there was a coordination. On that, Meadows, I mean, for you to say that you didn't know, I mean, if they're reaching out to you, then there is obviously this channel that has been at least unofficially acknowledged. If they're reaching out and they're saying, can you get Christopher Steele to do what? On one of the occasions when I talked to the FBI to tell them I got a call from Chris Steele, they said, oh, next time you talk with him, can you ask him if he's willing to meet with us? And I conveyed that back to Chris Steele. Meadows, after he had been terminated, or correct, Meadows, you got the same FBI that terminated, that have told the American people that, oh, when we found out there was a credibility problem, we terminated him. After that time, you basically got a call from the FBI that said, can you engage Mr. Steele again? Or, well, it wasn't a call, it was when I told them what I heard. So it was in-person contact. They said, by the way, can you ask him if he'd be willing to talk with us? Yes. All right. Were you aware, or did your wife characterize, or Glenn Simpson characterize anything that was on the 2 thumb drives that you were given? Did they give you kind of a contextual what was in there? Well, I knew that the thumb drive my wife gave me contained her research for Fusion GPS. The thumb drive that Glenn Simpson gave me, I immediately turned over to the FBI. But I think at the time, I suspected it was the dossier, and did he characterize it? That's my question. No. So he didn't say there's juicy stuff in here, there's dirt in here, or this is important, you need to get it there. He just said, this is a thumb drive, give it to the FBI. Yeah, he said that, and then Meadows, Mr. Orr, Mr. Orr, Mr. Orr. Berman, Mr. Meadows, can he finish his answer? Meadows, he can finish the answer, but at the same time, I want to make sure that we're shooting straight here. You're saying that Glenn Simpson gave you a thumb drive and didn't suggest what was on it or anything else and said, give it to the FBI, and your curiosity was not piqued? Or, I think I assumed it was the dossier, but he did not say that. Why did you assume it was the dossier? This was in December. The rest of the conversation had to do with additional information that he had gathered about the possible connections between the Russian government and the Trump campaign, and he gives me a thumb drive. I think the natural assumption at that point, I had not seen the dossier. I had heard there was such a thing as a dossier, but I hadn't seen it. So he gives me a thumb drive. I assume this was the dossier. How exactly did... Oh, Steele would have told him. I'm sorry. For a second, I was trying to think of how Bruce Orr would have known there was a dossier when it hadn't been made public. But obviously, Christopher Steele's been feeding it to him for months. I don't know why. I just totally blanked on that. Forgive me. To restate the last part of Orr's testimony, I had heard there was such a thing as a dossier, but I hadn't seen it, so he gives me a thumb drive. I assumed this was the dossier. Meadows. So he gives you the dossier, or what you believed to be the dossier. How did you first become aware of the dossier? I don't recall. It might have been in the press, or I don't remember. Now he's saying he doesn't even remember. Meadows. Well, so what you're saying is he gave you something that was already... How could it be in the press? Because I don't think it was printed until later, was it? Or, it wasn't printed, but I think people were aware there was such a thing as a dossier. It just hadn't been printed. I don't recall, specifically, but yeah. Meadows. All right. So let me go back because your conversations, I think Glenn Simpson has given sworn testimony that he never talked to you. And what you're saying under sworn testimony today is that indeed you've talked to Glenn Simpson. Or, I have talked to Glenn Simpson. Meadows. And actually, is it true that Glenn Simpson called you on Inauguration Day, according to your notes, January 20 of 2017, says, I needed to talk to you. Did you talk to him on Inauguration Day? You take good notes, by the way. Or, yes. Meadows, I can't read your handwriting. Or, many defense counsel complained about my handwriting as well. Yes, Glenn Simpson contacted me on or about January 20. Yes. And what was that about? He was concerned that one of the sources, Chris Steele's sources, was going to be supposed, and that would put the source in personal danger. And why was he concerned about that source being exposed? I think he was aware of some kind of article that was likely to come out in the next, few days or something. So how would Glenn Simpson know that, and the intel community and the Department of Justice and FBI not know that? I mean, what made Glenn Simpson so uniquely qualified to call you on Inauguration Day about a concern about a source being outed? I don't know what his sources are. So you mean he must have talked to the media? Did he share with you that he talked to the media? That he was concerned about that? I mean, help me understand that conversation from January 20. He says something along the lines of, there's going to be some reporting in the next few days that's could expose the source, and the source could be in potential danger. Meadows. And so when he's talking about there's going to be some reporting, there was a lot of reporting that was going on. Did you find it just normal protocol that the Department of Justice and the FBI would still engage when there was a number of facts or at least allegations that continued to be shared in the press? Did you find that concerning? Where were you having these one-on-one conversations and then reading about it in the press? Did you find that concerning? Or, well, what I recall at the time is being very concerned if someone's life was in danger, that we had to be able to respond to that. All right? So did you talk to Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, the Deputy Attorney Director, or Assistant Director, and Joe Pienka about the FISA application? No. So your notes from November 21st, where you got all their names and you talk about FISA, what's that in reference to? I don't think I said FISA. I think I asked him if they had a prosecutor, and they said no, and that they might look at Manafort again. And I don't recall the other thing, but I don't recall there was any discussion of FISA. Meadows. And so there was no discussion of FISA because Carter Page was really not the subject of your investigation? I don't know I wasn't part of any FISA investigation, so I don't know. All right. So help me reconcile two things. Earlier you said that all you did was got information. You passed it on. Just now you talked about that you actually had conversations between you and some of the other people as it relates to, how you prosecute or what you were going to do or who was going to be involved. So how extensive were those conversations? I believe this was the only time, and I did ask, is there a prosecutor? Yeah. So if this was the only time, then why would your notes suggest on March 15th of 2017, why would your notes suggest that you had discussions about a special prosecutor? I would like to see the notes to be sure, but my recollection, I can refresh your memory, yes, but my recollection is that Chris Steele was concerned about queries from Congress or from special counsel or whoever that might expose his source's identity, and so he asked about that. Meadows. Well, there was different notes about that, so let me refresh your memory. You were concerned about a special counsel being able to ask questions in the UK. That was your notes. That was your own individual notes. Or, that Chris Steele had asked something along the lines of, can a special prosecutor ask questions? So why were you having discussions with Christopher Steele about a special prosecutor before one was ever appointed? Or, it's just something, Meadows, because one wasn't appointed for another 2 months. Or, Meadows. So why were you having questions about prosecution with a special prosecutor with a source that you said all you were doing was taking the information and get it to the FBI? I wrote down what Chris Steele asked about. I often could not answer his questions, and this was one of those times. He said, can a special prosecutor ask questions in the UK? And I'm sure I've said something like, I don't know, but, Meadows, did you ever get back to him with that answer? No. And so you just let him ask the question and you never responded? I couldn't answer many of his questions. All right, so let me finish with this, and I'll yield to my good friend, the gentleman from Texas. Your testimony earlier indicated you handled this differently than anything you've done in your career at the Department of Justice. I mean, you said that this was a unique circumstance, and yet it appears that there was, according to your testimony, there was either an implied or a confirmed relationship between the FBI and you to get information from Chris Steele to them after he was terminated. Is that correct? It's correct to the extent that the FBI knew I was continuing to get contacted by Chris Steele, and they had given me an agent to contact to provide, to forward the information. So, Meadows, yeah, but you're changing that a little bit because you did admit that they reached out to you. So there was this coordination that was happening. Obviously, you had conversations with Lisa Page and McCabe, and some of them about prosecuting and how you would go about it. So there's actually more of a relationship there than perhaps I'm getting information because I happen to have a personal relationship with Christopher Steele. Or, yes, as we discussed earlier, as I said earlier, there was the one occasion where I did ask Lisa Page and Peter Strzok, do you have a prosecutor? And that's what they told me. I did not pass that information to anybody. And on the one occasion in 2017, the FBI, when I reported to them one of my conversations with Chris Steele, they said, can you ask him if he'd be willing to meet with us? So on those two occasions, there was more conversation. Did Andy McCabe or Peter Strzok or Lisa Page ever talk to you about getting a special prosecutor involved after the election of 2016? I don't think so, no. I don't have any recollection of that. So did they suggest that to Christopher Steele? Not that I know of. I guess, why did it come up? I mean, why would Christopher Steele ask that question when it is a fairly infrequent use in terms of the way we prosecute things? Why did it have come up if it wasn't being discussed? Weinsheimer, just a second. Discussion of the record. Or, right, that's what I was going to say. So basically, I don't know what. What I can say is that at various times, it's clear to me that Chris Steele is not an expert in the U.S. judicial system. So he would sometimes ask things that didn't quite, weren't obvious. I'm sorry, there's a difference between obvious and obscure. And for someone in the UK to ask about a U.S. special prosecutor, in my mind, that's highly suggestive that someone had tipped him off that might be an upcoming process. I'm with Meadows on this. There's more than meets the eye in this part of the testimony as far as I'm concerned. Or continues. So he would sometimes ask things that didn't quite, weren't obvious, but beyond, or, where it didn't quite make sense about the U.S. judicial system. But in this case, I don't know why he asked that question. Did Chris Steele get paid by the Department of Justice? My understanding is that for a time, he was a source for the FBI, a paid source. Meadows, I'll yield to my good friend, Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Orr, I want to follow up on the issue of the authority or permission that you had to be engaging with Christopher Steele. I know you have been asked about this by Mr. Gowdy and Mr. Meadows, but I have to cover this again because I'm really trying to establish what the Department of Justice knew and what the FBI knew as it relates to the FISA process. I know that you weren't involved in the actual FISA applications, but what the FBI and the Department of Justice knew through you is important. And so you've been asked a couple of questions about this engagement, and you've several times said you thought it was part of your job to get and pass along source information. And I think you're relating that. Is it fair to say that you didn't really think you needed authority or permission, that it was just part of your job that allowed you to do that? Or, correct. Okay, and you said you had done it in a number of other times in other cases. Yes. Okay. Had you ever done it in any other cases where your wife was involved? I don't recall my wife being involved in any of those other cases. Okay. But isn't that what makes this case different? Is that you're passing along information where you know that your wife is involved and you know that your wife is being compensated for her involvement, correct? So that is yes. And that is why I began, when I first spoke to the FBI about this, to emphasize my wife is working for Fusion GPS. Okay, and I get that, and I'm going to get to that in terms of how you explain that. But there are a number of us who used to work at the Department of Justice. I'm trying to understand your mindset for the Sally Yates issue and what she knew and when she knew it. You know, there are rules against being involved in cases where you get a financial benefit. Yes. And there are requirements and obligations that prosecutors have if those circumstances arise. Yes. And what are those obligations? Or, if I was working on the case, I would probably have to get off the case. And as it relates to getting a financial benefit, well, I mean, my wife can work for whoever she works for, but I can't work on a case where she's getting a financial benefit. Right. And so in this case, she was getting a financial benefit? Right. But I wasn't working on the case. Ratcliffe, other than to be part of the chain of custody of evidence, is your testimony. I passed along the information I got. All right. Well, we don't. The facts will speak for themselves with respect to this. See, and that's another dissembling on Orr's part, because he said that he was part of the chain of custody with those memory sticks, those thumb drives. He said that specifically. So it's not just a matter of him passing along information he got. He was a fact witness by being part of the chain of custody. So there's more than just that. Ratcliffe, but you were asked a question about how much your wife was paid. You said you weren't sure. This $44,000, does that sound approximately correct? That could be, but I don't know as I sit here. Okay. If money that your wife was paid for her work on this case, would ultimately you benefit from that financially? In other words, do you have shared accounts? Yes, we do. Okay. Did you ever file financial disclosures reflecting that you receive financial benefits as it pertained to your wife, Nellie, or on a matter before the Department of Justice? No, he didn't. No, he didn't. Or, not that I received. I filed the public financial disclosure reports regularly. I did not report that I was receiving money in connection with the matter I was working on because, in my mind, I'm not. Yeah, well, you were. Ratcliffe, do others think that was an incorrect assumption on your part? Weinsheimer, I don't think he's able to answer what others. Ratcliffe, well, are there actions that may have been taken by the Department of Justice or any of its investigating arms with respect to the disclosures, the financial disclosures, as it pertains to Nellie Orr's work? Weinsheimer, hang on one second. Or, as far as I know, no. Ratcliffe, and I'm trying to understand this. I'm not trying to embarrass you, but it's been publicly reported that you've been demoted from different positions. Is that an accurate public reporting? Or, I've been moved twice since December. Yes. Ratcliffe, okay. Just briefly give me the circumstances and the timing of the moves. Because at the relevant time period here, again, I think you've been clear. You were the ADAG, or the Associate Deputy Attorney General, correct? I was an ADAG, yes. Yeah. And so you have had 2 position changes since then. Yes. So in December of 2017, I was told that there were going to be articles relating to my conversations with Chris Steele in the press, and they were going to move me out of the office of Deputy Attorney General, but retain me as the director of the OCDETF. They gave me 2 reasons. One was they said I had not given them timely notice of my conversation with Chris Steele, and the other one they said was that they were planning to change the structure of the department anyway because I was a component head and, as far as the only component head who was sitting in the office of Deputy Attorney General. So as part of the broader reorganization of the department, they had planned to move me out of the Deputy Attorney General's office. Total coincidence that he screwed up, they found out, and then they eliminated his job. Total coincidence. Ratcliffe, all right, that's the first one. Or, yes. And then in January or at the end of December, I don't remember the exact date, but right around there, I was informed that the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General did not want me in a position where I would be having contact with the White House as part of my work. And because OCDETF did have contact with the White House, and particularly the National Security Council on Organized Crime Policy, they were going to move me into the Criminal Division. So now they're insulating you. Ratcliffe, okay. So with respect to the first move in December of 2017, you said you weren't they said you weren't giving timely notice of your communications with Christopher Steele. Who was they? I was informed by Scott Schools and Jim Kroll in the Deputy Attorney General's office. All right. And then in January of 2018, when you were told that the AG and the Deputy AG did not want you in that position, which at that point, depending on what point, just for the record, who was the AG and who was the Deputy AG at that point? Oh, that was Attorney General Sessions and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein. So getting back to the issue that I mentioned regarding what the Department of Justice knew and what the FBI knew, you're not sure what Sally Yates knew about your involvement. You just said you hadn't told her anything about that. Correct. Okay, but you've identified at the Department of Justice folks as early as August of 2016, or folks at the Department of Justice and the FBI being aware of your involvement. At the Department of Justice, Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Weissman, and the third name I didn't get, Zainab or Ahmad, Ms. Ahmad. Ratcliffe Ahmad. Can you spell that for me? Or, I think it's AHMAD, but I'm not sure. Okay. And the first name was Zainab. Did you say? Zainab, I believe. That's Z-A-I-N-A-B. And my baloney has a first name. It's M-A-Y-E-R. M-E-Y-E-R. Ratcliffe. All right. And over at the FBI, the folks that you have identified, obviously you met with Andy McCabe, Lisa Page, Peter Strzok. Yes. Who else? Joe Pienka. Joe Pienka. So again, so the record is clear with respect to what the Department of Justice and the FBI knew about your involvement. These are the folks that were aware as of August 2016 that you had an involvement with Christopher Steele. Weinsheimer. Hang on a second. Discussion off the record. Or, those are the people that I knew that I had told. I had told them, of course, at different times, as I mentioned before. I had met with Mr. McCabe and Lisa Page very early on. And then later I had met with the larger group of people that you named. And in fact, Mr. Pienka, I don't think I met with until November. Mr. Ratcliffe, well, okay. So just so you know, we're coming up on 12 o'clock, so we're getting, or 12 o'clock my time, top of the hour. So we're getting close to a break. If I can find a clean spot to break at, I will do so, even if it's a few minutes more or less. But we are coming up in a few minutes on our first break of the day. And again, as I said before, there may or may not be a dinner break at 5:30, depending on how much more testimony we've got to go. If it looks like I can push through and then eat dinner later, I'll do that. I'll take a short break at 5:30 just to grab a couple tangerines or something. But right now, let me look here. We are at page 118, and I believe this goes to page 268. So we're doing pretty well. We're doing really well. I can't say we will be able to push through, but I'm going to keep an eye on it. Let's go back here. Okay, Joe Pienka. Weinsheimer asks for a brief moment. They have a discussion off the record. Mr. Orr, those are the people that I knew that I had told. I had told them, of course, at different times. As I mentioned before, I had met with Mr. McCabe and Lisa Page very early on, and then later I had met with the larger group of people that you named. And in fact, Mr. Pienka, I don't think I met until November. Ratcliffe, okay. Well, so, and I'm not holding you to a specific date, but you said shortly after your meeting with Christopher Steele, you called Andy McCabe. Is that what you said? Correct. And you believe within a few weeks or some short period of time, you estimated, probably in August, that you met with Mr. McCabe, Ms. Page, or yes, Ratcliffe, and Peter Strzok? Or, I don't believe Peter was there. I don't recall. I don't think so. Ratcliffe, okay. And when you say there, that was it at Mr. McCabe's office? Mr. McCabe's office, okay. All right. And so with respect to the Department of Justice, what is your best recollection of when Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Weissman, and Ms. Ahmad, or Ahmad, yes. I don't recall exactly. Ratcliffe, do you know if it was around the same time frame as Mr. McCabe and Ms. Page, or it may not all have been at the same time? Ratcliffe, is it fair to say it would have been at least in the summer or early fall of 2016? Yes. Yes, I think so, yes. Ratcliffe, okay. And what were your contacts with Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Weissman, and Ms. Ahmad? Or, I remember mentioning this to Bruce Schwartz, and because Ms. Ahmad worked closely with him, She may have been present. And then at some point I had a conversation with the two of them and with Mr. Weissman. And I don't remember if that's the same meeting that Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were at. It could have been, but I don't recall specifically. Okay, and would those meetings have taken place at Main Justice? Yes. All right, there's reference into your notes about a meeting in September of 2016 at Perkins Coie. That doesn't ring a bell, I'm sorry. Are you aware of a meeting with? Was there a meeting with Glenn Simpson, Fusion GPS, Mr. Steele, and others that you were involved with? Or, I met once with Chris Steele in September when he came to town, but it was just him and me, just two of us. Yeah. I don't believe I had any meetings with any of these other folks. Ratcliffe, all right. Well, the reason I'm trying to, again, you're aware of this even though you weren't involved in the FISA, the process, you know, that ultimately that the FBI and Department of Justice has been publicly reported, filed verified applications to get a warrant to surveil an American citizen, Carter Page. You're aware of that? Or from the press? Yes. Ratcliffe, from the press. And you're aware that occurred the first time on October 21 of 2016. I'll let you may or may not be aware of the date. Not aware of the date. Ratcliffe, I'll represent to you that was the date. But you know as a prosecutor that when you make those verifications, and the folks on behalf of the FBI and the Department of Justice that do so, they have to verify that the information on the FISA application has been thoroughly vetted and confirmed. We've talked a little bit about that. You had no role with respect to that. I think there are real questions whether or not that was done. But the other obligation that we know that we had, or you continue to have as a federal prosecutors, is to make full disclosure of material facts. Correct? And here's where they take a break. Right on time. Okay. So when we come back, we will resume with Mr. Ratcliffe questioning Mr. Orr. The timestamp is 12:19. We will be back here at 12:30 thereabouts, not earlier. I can promise you that. If I do start a minute or two late, that's on me, but I will not start before 12:30. And again, that's my time, Central Time. But if you want to think of it as at the bottom of the hour, at 30 minutes past the hour, if that works for you, you go right ahead. So I'm going to stop the stream, and then I'll put up a notification of the next stream starting at 12:30. And I will begin that stream a few minutes before 12:30 to allow you to get in and get set up. And then I'll start the stream I'll start the conversation again as close to 12:30 without being before, as I can manage. So with that said, thank you all very much. Jason Picasso knows. Really appreciate all your help and your feedback. It means a lot. It's very useful, and I appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to put up the clouds, stop the stream, and then I will see you on or about 12:30. Thank you.